This video will help you sleep and relax. But before we begin, I would like to know which city you're from and what time you're watching this. Now, subscribe to the channel, relax, and let's begin. I first noticed the footsteps about a month after I moved into my new apartment. It was late afternoon, and I was walking home from the grocery store. The street was quiet. There were no cars passing by, no people strolling around. I held 2 paper bags, one in each hand, and focused on reaching my building quickly. Then I heard it, soft steps behind me, keeping pace. At first I assumed it was another resident heading home. I glanced over my shoulder. The sidewalk behind me was empty. I saw no one. I slowed down, curious. The footsteps slowed too, staying the same distance away. My heart beat a bit faster. I stopped walking. For a second, there was silence. Then I heard the steps continue, as if someone walked right past me. But I saw nothing, just the empty sidewalk. The sound moved forward, then faded. I shook my head and kept walking, trying not to feel spooked. Maybe I imagined it. The next day, I heard it again. It was evening, around 6. I had just left the bus stop and was heading home. The streets were not crowded, but there were a few people around this time. I heard footsteps behind me, evenly spaced, not too fast, not too slow. I stepped aside, pretending to tie my shoe, to let whoever was behind me pass. No one passed, but the footsteps sounded like they moved right by me again. I looked up. Nobody. Just a man far ahead, too far to produce these footsteps. A woman across the street, busy with her phone. No one close. I felt a chill. I tried not to panic. Maybe there was some echo from a nearby alley. Maybe my ears were playing tricks. I reached my apartment building and hurried inside. That night I slept poorly, thinking about those strange footsteps. Over the next week it happened every time I walked home. Always the same pattern. I'd hear footsteps following at a constant distance. If I stopped, they continued, passing me as if an invisible person walked through me. If I looked around, I saw nothing. Eventually, I tried a different route home. I took a longer path, circling 2 extra blocks. The footsteps followed anyway, always the same distance behind, always vanishing when I stopped. I started walking faster, almost jogging home, trying to outrun the sound. It never fell behind. It kept the exact same pace, no matter how slow or fast I went. I grew paranoid. I kept checking over my shoulder, scanning doorways, alleys, windows. Never saw anyone suspicious. Yet, the footsteps were real. I could hear the soft crunch of soles on pavement, sometimes the faint scuff of a step catching a crack in the sidewalk. After 2 weeks, I tried waiting at the bus stop for a while, letting time pass, hoping to throw off whatever followed me. When I finally headed home, the footsteps appeared again as soon as I turned onto my street. I felt sweat on my palms. I tried talking out loud. "Who's there?" No answer. Just the steps, perfectly timed with mine, but always a few meters behind. When I reached my building that night, I bolted inside, slamming the lobby door behind me. I pressed the elevator button with shaking fingers. In the elevator, I breathed deeply, trying to calm myself. Inside my apartment, I double-locked the door. I felt safer, but as I moved around, putting my keys down, taking off my shoes, I heard something in the hallway outside my unit. Heavy steps going up the stairs. My floor was the 2nd floor. I rushed to the door and looked through the peephole. No one in the hallway, but I heard the steps fade upwards, as if someone went to the 3rd floor. After a few minutes, silence returned. The following evening, I listened carefully as I approached the building. I could still hear the footsteps behind me on the street. But now I was more interested in what happened inside. As I walked up the lobby stairs, I skipped the elevator this time. I heard the footsteps echo behind me again. This time, inside the building. I climbed faster. The steps matched me. I reached my apartment and unlocked it, then shut the door quickly. I pressed my ear against the wood. The footsteps continued in the hallway, passing my door, heading up. I couldn't understand it. The building was old and had thin floors. Maybe I heard a neighbor, but why did it always match my pace? That night, I woke up to a noise inside my apartment. Footsteps, heavy and slow, pacing the living room. My heart pounded. I lay still in bed, holding my breath. I checked the time on my phone. It was just after midnight. The building was silent except for those steps in my apartment. I listened carefully. They moved from the living room toward the kitchen, then back again to the hallway that led to my bedroom. The door to my room was closed. I heard the floorboards creak as if someone stood just on the other side. I got up, grabbed a lamp from the bedside table, and swung the door open. The hallway was empty. I turned on every light, shaking with fear. I searched every corner, every closet, behind every piece of furniture. No one was there. The windows were locked. No signs of forced entry. I stood in the living room, breathing hard, trying to calm down. Then I heard the footsteps again, but this time on the floor above me, as if whoever it was had moved upstairs. I decided not to sleep that night. I stayed on the couch with the lights on. In the morning, I felt tired and confused. I talked to a neighbor I knew slightly, asking if she had heard anything at night. She shook her head. She seemed concerned, but offered no explanation. I didn't want to sound crazy, so I dropped the subject. That evening, I came home earlier than usual. I was trying to see if arriving at a different time would help. It didn't. As soon as I turned into my street, I heard the footsteps behind me. This time, I stopped several times in a row. Each time, the footsteps passed me and then vanished. But after a few steps, they'd return behind me again. I asked out loud again, "What do you want?" Silence, except for the quiet steps. I rushed inside the building, ran upstairs, and slammed my apartment door. I checked all the locks and even pushed a chair against the door. I turned on the TV for noise. After an hour of watching something mindless, I muted it and listened. Silence. I sighed with relief and decided to try to sleep in my bedroom. I left a lamp on in the hallway just in case. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to the sound of footsteps inside my apartment again. This time they were louder, heavier, as if whatever made them had gained weight. They moved slowly from room to room. I held my breath. My body trembled. I knew I had locked everything. I knew no one could have entered. Yet, I could hear them clearly. I got out of bed quietly and opened the door a crack. I saw nothing. The hallway was empty. But the sound was right there, as if someone stood invisible in front of me. I shouted, "Go away!" My voice shook. The footsteps paused. Then they started again, heading toward me. I slammed the bedroom door and locked it. I pressed my back against it, my heart thudding in my chest. The footsteps reached the other side of the door and stopped. I felt a slight pressure on the handle, as if someone tried to turn it. I screamed, "Leave me alone!" Tears rolled down my cheeks. Then, as suddenly as they came, the footsteps retreated. I didn't sleep that night. In the morning, I called a locksmith and had the locks changed. I installed a heavy deadbolt and a security chain. I knew it wouldn't help if whatever this was wasn't human, but I needed to do something. I also bought a small camera and pointed it at the living room, hoping to catch something on video. That evening, I walked home, expecting the footsteps behind me. They appeared right on schedule. I hurried inside, locked the door, and checked the camera's live feed on my phone. It showed my empty living room. I sat on the couch, watching the camera feed and waiting. Around midnight, I heard the footsteps again, first in the hallway outside, then inside my apartment. I looked at my phone. Nothing on the camera, just the empty room. But I could hear them walking right in front of the camera's angle. No movement, no shadow. I cursed under my breath, feeling powerless. I started shouting questions. Who are you? What do you want from me? No reply, just steps circling the coffee table, moving toward the kitchen, then back. I grabbed a broom and swung it at the air, hoping to hit something invisible. I felt no resistance. The footsteps continued. Eventually, they faded toward the door and disappeared. Over the next few days, the pattern repeated. Every evening, footsteps followed me home. Every night, they roamed my apartment, sometimes heavy, sometimes lighter. I never saw anything, never caught anything on camera or audio. The microphone only recorded silence, but I heard them. I felt them. They were real. My health declined. I slept poorly, lost weight, jumped at small sounds. I tried staying at a friend's house one night. The footsteps didn't follow me there. I slept well. But when I returned home the next day, they started again, as if waiting for me. It seemed tied to that apartment, or maybe tied to me only when I approached it. I decided to confront it directly. One night, I stood in the living room with the lights on and said calmly, "If you can hear me, give me a sign. Knock on the wall." The footsteps paused. I heard a single knock on the far wall. I nearly fainted. I said, "Why are you here?" No answer, just footsteps pacing again. I asked, "Do you need something?" Footsteps paused, then resumed. No words, no other sounds. I realized it wouldn't communicate. It just existed, following me, haunting my apartment. I considered moving out, but I had a lease I couldn't break easily. I tried talking to the landlord. He looked uncomfortable, said he never heard of such a thing. He hinted maybe I was stressed and imagining things. I knew better. As days passed, the footsteps became heavier at night. They sounded like boots on a wooden floor, even though my floor was carpeted. Each step sent a vibration up my spine. I tried wearing headphones to sleep, blasting music to block the sound. The footsteps grew louder, as if determined to be heard. One night, they stomped so heavily that I felt the bed shake. I ripped off the headphones and screamed. I heard a low creaking sound, like the door hinge moving, but the door stayed closed. I cried out for help, but no one came. The neighbors never complained or acknowledged the noise. I reached a breaking point. I decided to pack a bag and leave. I didn't care about the lease anymore. I would stay at a motel, figure out the financial loss later. I just wanted to be free of these invisible steps. On my last night, as I packed my clothes, I heard the footsteps approach from the hallway. They stood at my bedroom door again. This time, I didn't scream or cry. I said quietly, "I'm leaving. You win." The footsteps came closer, as if entering the room. I felt a cold air brush my face. My hair stood on end. I backed against the wall, holding a suitcase in one hand. The steps circled me. I turned on the flashlight on my phone, shining it around wildly. Nothing, just empty air and the sound of feet on the floor. I inched toward the door, determined to leave. The footsteps followed me, staying just behind my shoulder. I yanked the door open and ran into the hallway, down the stairs, out onto the street. I stood there, breathing hard, looking around. The street was quiet. No footsteps, just distant traffic sounds. I realized they never followed me outside, only on the way home. With my suitcase in hand, I walked away from that building and never went back. A few days later, I sent an email to the landlord. saying I had moved out due to personal reasons. I didn't explain the footsteps. He never replied. I found a new place far away. For a few weeks I expected to hear those steps again, but I never did. Outside my old apartment, I was safe. Sometimes I think about it, wondering what it was. A ghost, a presence, something attached to that building or that apartment. I have no proof. I only have my memories of those relentless footsteps following me at night, climbing stairs with me, walking through my rooms unseen. I'm just glad it's over. I learned to live without answers. At least now, when I walk home, I hear only my own steps on the sidewalk, and that's enough. Borrow the gramophone on a whim. It happened on a Saturday afternoon when I was browsing a small antiques shop downtown. The place smelled like dust and old paper. The owner barely looked at me. I walked through the cramped aisles, touching wooden boxes and faded photographs. Then I saw it on a low shelf, a gramophone with a dark wooden base and a brass horn. It looked old but well preserved. There was no price tag. I asked the owner how much it cost. He squinted at me, then at the gramophone. He said a number I don't remember now, something cheap. I took it, feeling lucky. As I left, he said something strange. I don't recall selling that before. I laughed, assuming he was just old and forgetful. When I got home, I placed the gramophone on a small table in my living room. I don't usually collect antiques, but this piece looked good. It gave the room a bit of character. That evening, I dusted it off and tried to see if it worked. I didn't have old records, but it had a strange mechanism that allowed me to turn a small crank and then set the needle. I expected no sound or maybe static. Instead, I heard soft, scratchy music. It sounded like an old jazz tune, something gentle and slow. It surprised me. I didn't see any record spinning, yet it played. I sat on the couch, listening. The music filled the room with a warm, distant sound. It was comforting. I felt relaxed. After a while, I turned it off and went to bed, thinking I'd figure it out tomorrow. Maybe there was a hidden record inside, or a preloaded cylinder. I had no idea how old gramophones worked. The next evening, after work, I turned it on again. This time the music sounded different. It was slower, a sad melody, with a piano and a soft humming voice. It fit my mood. I'd had a stressful day. Somehow the music calmed me. I sat close to the gramophone, running my fingertips along the wooden base. The sound was rich, but I still couldn't figure out where it was coming from. Over the next few nights, I noticed something odd. The music seemed to match how I felt. If I was tired, it played soft lullabies. If I was upset, it played gentle tunes that soothed me. One night, I was angry after a fight with a coworker, and the music turned harsh, dissonant, making me uncomfortable. I turned it off quickly. The gramophone seemed to know my mood. That made no sense. I started experimenting. One day, I came home feeling happy because I received good news. I turned on the gramophone. It played a lively tune, something with a trumpet and a fast rhythm. I laughed, feeling a chill on my arms. This was strange, too strange. I turned it off, deciding I would return it to the antique shop. But the next day, I went back there, and the owner acted like he had never seen me before. He claimed he never sold a gramophone recently. I insisted, but he shrugged. He said maybe I got it elsewhere. I left confused and a bit scared. A few nights later, as I listened to the gramophone's quiet strings, I heard a whisper. At first I thought it was part of the music, but it sounded like my name, spoken softly under the melody. I leaned closer, heart pounding. I heard it again. A gentle voice, maybe a woman's, whispering my name. I jumped up, turned on all the lights, and switched off the gramophone. The whisper stopped. I stood there sweating, trying to calm down. Did I imagine it? I avoided the gramophone for a few days. I kept busy, not wanting to go near it. But my curiosity got the better of me. One Saturday night, I turned it on again. Soft music played, a violin and a piano. After a minute, I heard my name again, a quiet whisper. Michael. I froze. This was impossible. I checked the room for hidden speakers. Nothing. I gently lifted the gramophone's horn, looked inside. Just darkness and old metal parts. The voice continued, mingling with the music. It said small things like, I see you, or you're not alone. My heart raced. I turned it off and disconnected it from the wall. It stopped playing. I stood there shaking. How could it produce sound if it was disconnected? I realized I never noticed a power cord before. I checked again. The gramophone wasn't plugged into anything. I felt a chill on my spine. That night I barely slept. I kept thinking about that voice. It sounded familiar, like my own voice, but softer, or maybe someone who knew me well. The next morning, I decided I must be losing my mind. I tried to ignore the gramophone, but I heard it even when it was off. Sometimes I'd catch a faint melody in the silence of my apartment. When I put my ear against the horn, I heard distant whispers. They said my name, described moments of my life, mentioned places I'd been. There was no one else in my apartment. I lived alone. I tried taking it back to the antique shop again, but the building was closed. A sign said, "For rent." The shop was gone. I walked around the block, confused. How could a shop vanish in a week? Back home, I sat in front of the gramophone. I said out loud, "What do you want?" Then I turned it on. The music crackled softly, then a whisper responded, "We know you." I felt sweat on my forehead. "Who are you?" I asked, voice trembling. The whisper replied, "We follow your life. We sing it." I pulled away, almost tripping over the coffee table. I rushed to the bedroom and closed the door. My heart hammered. My mouth was dry. After a few minutes, I opened the door a crack. The apartment was silent. The gramophone didn't follow me. It just sat on its table. Over the next days, I tried to ignore it. But at night, I heard faint music through the walls. I tried turning on the TV to block it out. The music found a way to be heard anyway. It whispered secrets about my past. I heard it mention my ex's name, my childhood home, my favorite teacher. Each memory matched the mood of the melody. A sad memory came with a mournful tune. A happy memory came with a lively rhythm. I felt violated. It knew everything. I tried throwing it away. I carried it down the stairs and dumped it in the alley behind my building. I walked back, feeling relief. That night I slept well for the first time in weeks. In the morning, I found the gramophone back on my table. I screamed in frustration. I grabbed it and shook it, yelling, "Leave me alone!" Silence. Then a soft hum emerged from the horn, like laughter without tone. I realized I was trapped. The gramophone wouldn't leave. It knew my secrets. It whispered my name at night. It predicted my moods and matched them with music. I decided to try a different approach. I sat down, turned it on, and said, "What do you want from me?" The music faded, and the whisper came clearly this time. "We play your life. We know your fears. We know your hopes." I asked, "Why me?" No answer. Just a low hum, then a tune that sounded like a heartbeat. I tried smashing it. I took a hammer and struck the wooden base. It chipped slightly, but the gramophone remained intact. I hit the brass horn. It dented a bit, but the music didn't stop. The whisper laughed, a quiet hiss. I threw the hammer aside and fell to my knees, panting. The gramophone played a soft lullaby, as if to mock me. Days passed. My routine was broken. I couldn't focus at work. I rushed home each day, hoping to find the gramophone gone. It was always there, waiting. One evening, I noticed the music had changed. Instead of old jazz or classical tunes, it played a song describing my day. I could hear my own voice whispering events that happened at work. A meeting, a joke I told. It was like a diary, set to music. That terrified me more than anything else. It was inside my head, recording my life. I stopped bringing people to my apartment. I feared they would hear it, or worse, it would say something too personal. I isolated myself. The gramophone became my unwanted roommate. Every night it played. Sometimes it comforted me when I felt lonely. Sometimes it taunted me when I tried to sleep. It never repeated a tune. Always something new, always fitting the moment. I began talking to it regularly. If it was going to stalk my life, I wanted answers. "Why do you record my life?" I asked. The whisper responded, "We must." "Who are you?" I demanded. "We are the sound of your existence," it said. That made no sense. I got angry. "Get out of my life," I shouted. The gramophone played a harsh chord, hurting my ears. Over time, I noticed another change. The music started to include words that described my future actions. One night, I heard it mention that I would receive a call. Minutes later, my phone rang. My brother called unexpectedly. Another time, it said I would find money on the street. The next day, I found a $20 bill near the bus stop. It was predicting events now, not just replaying my day. This frightened me. If it knew my future, maybe it controlled it. I tried to ignore its predictions. I refused to act differently. But the events happened anyway. I began to rely on it. I asked, "What will happen tomorrow?" The whisper replied with vague hints, a tune that suggested good or bad outcomes. I found myself checking with it before making decisions. I hated myself for that, but I felt trapped. One night, I had enough. I packed a suitcase and decided to leave town. I would go far away, stay in a hotel, never return. I grabbed my keys, opened the door, and stepped into the hallway. I heard music coming from inside my apartment. A sad, pleading violin. I hesitated. Then I forced myself to leave. I got into my car and drove. I stayed in a hotel 100 miles away. I hardly slept. I expected the gramophone to appear in my room, but it didn't. In the morning I drove back, worried it might be gone or angry. It was still there on my table. The music was quiet, a soft apology. The whisper said, "You returned." My heart sank. I realized I couldn't escape it. I sat down and cried. The gramophone played a gentle tune, like a lullaby for a child. As weeks turned into months, I learned to live with it. It was part of my life now. I stopped trying to fight it. Sometimes I listened quietly, enjoying the music that matched my mood. Sometimes I asked questions, and it replied with cryptic whispers. I accepted that I would never understand it. I still felt fear, but also a strange comfort. I was never alone now. It was always there, watching, recording, guiding. I tried once more to find the antique shop, to confront the owner. The building was empty and boarded up. No trace of the old man. I asked neighbors if they remembered the shop. None did. I realized I was on my own. The gramophone changed me. I became cautious, careful not to anger it. I followed its subtle hints, avoiding trouble. My life smoothed out, less chaos. But I also lost my privacy. Every thought, every emotion was reflected in its tunes. When I felt sad, it mourned with me. When I felt joy, it celebrated. When I tried to hide something, it revealed it in a quiet whisper. I learned to speak less, to keep my mind blank, but it still knew. I guessed that it fed off my life, turning it into sound. I wondered if it would ever leave. It never answered that question. Now I live day to day, sharing my home with a strange, ancient device that sings my life back to me. I keep my secrets to a minimum, because it will expose them anyway. I try not to feel strong emotions, because the music intensifies them. I exist in a careful balance, neither too happy nor too sad, neither angry nor afraid, just calm. This seems to keep the gramophone quiet and the whispers soft. Sometimes I sit in silence and it doesn't play anything. Those moments feel precious, like a break from constant surveillance. Then, when I least expect it, a gentle tune begins, describing a distant memory or a future event. I take a deep breath and listen, accepting that this is my life now. I first noticed the letters about a month ago. I came home from work that day feeling tired. My mail usually included bills, flyers, and maybe a magazine. Nothing special. That afternoon, I found a single envelope on my doormat inside my apartment. It had no name or address on it. Just a plain white envelope, closed with a piece of tape. I assumed it was junk or some strange promotion. I opened it and found a small piece of paper. It said, "A spilled coffee." That's all. No signature, no explanation. I crumpled it up and threw it in the trash. I didn't think about it until the next morning. I was at my usual coffee place before work. As I took my first sip, a man next to me slipped and bumped into my arm. I spilled my entire coffee on my shirt. I remembered the note. It had predicted this. I got a strange feeling in my stomach. The next few days were normal, no letters. I started to doubt my memory. Maybe it was a coincidence. Then, about 3 days later, another letter appeared on my floor. No markings again. I picked it up. Inside was a piece of paper that read, "You will receive a call you do not expect." I felt uneasy. My phone didn't ring often. Around midday, my old colleague, whom I hadn't spoken to in years, called. He said he found my number on an old contact list. He was just checking in. I hung up feeling uneasy. The second letter had also predicted something. I began to dread checking my door. The hallway in my building was quiet. My neighbors kept to themselves. I had no idea who was slipping these letters under my door. I tried leaving work early one day to catch them. I stood inside, peeking through the peephole every hour. Nothing happened, but by the next morning there was another letter. This time it said, "A broken glass at 10 a.m. I watched the time closely. I sat at my desk at work, careful not to touch anything breakable. At exactly 10 a.m., I heard a crash in the office kitchen. One of my coworkers dropped a glass. I felt sweat on my neck. This was no coincidence. The letters kept coming, maybe twice a week. Each one predicted a small event in my life. A stranger would say my name on the street. A car horn would blare right as I crossed an intersection. I would trip on a curb. Minor things, but always accurate. Always something that happened the next day. I started saving the letters, lining them up on my kitchen table. Each was on a small white slip of paper with the same neat handwriting. I couldn't identify the handwriting. It was plain, block letters. After a few weeks, the letters changed. They no longer predicted small accidents or random events. They started mentioning personal things. One said, "You still think about that argument with your brother." I read it 3 times. I had fought with my brother years ago, and we hadn't spoken since. I never told anyone at my new job about it. Another letter said, "You hide your anxiety pills in the old coffee tin." I froze when I read that. I kept my medication in an empty coffee tin on the top shelf of my kitchen cabinet. No one should know that. Now I felt watched. My apartment seemed invaded. I checked the windows, the closets, behind the sofa, under the bed. I found nothing. I went down to the lobby and asked the doorman if he saw anyone deliver envelopes. He shook his head. He said only regular mail came in through the locked boxes. The letters had no postage, so they weren't mailed. Someone must be slipping them under my door directly. I felt sick thinking about it. Each new letter revealed more personal details. "You never told anyone about that night you cried in the parking lot." I remembered that night. It was after a bad date. I sat in my car and cried for a few minutes. I never mentioned it to a soul. Another letter. "You still keep that old photo hidden in your sock drawer." I ran to my bedroom and opened the drawer. The photo of my ex was there, hidden under some socks. I had forgotten about it, but apparently not whoever was sending these letters. I tried staying awake all night, waiting by the door with the lights off. Around 3 a.m., I dozed off. When I woke up at 6, a new envelope was there. It said, "You cannot stay awake forever." I slammed my fist on the floor, furious. I opened the door and looked down the hallway. It was empty, silent. I installed a small camera in my apartment's entryway, a cheap motion-activated camera linked to my phone. I hoped to catch whoever delivered the letters. That night, I slept lightly. At 4 a.m., my phone buzzed. Motion detected. I jumped up and rushed to the door. No one was there. I checked the footage. It showed only static during the exact moment of delivery. Afterward, I found another letter. "Camera won't help." I felt my heart pound in my ears. Whoever this was knew my every move. Over time, the letters changed again. They started giving me choices. "Tomorrow at noon, turn left instead of right." That's all it said. I decided to ignore it. I walked my usual route to lunch, turning right. As I stepped off the curb, I narrowly missed being hit by a speeding delivery bike. I jumped back, my heart racing. If I had turned left as instructed, I might have avoided that scare. Another letter said, "Do not answer the phone at 3 p.m. At 3 p.m., my phone rang. I hesitated. I answered it anyway. It was my mother calling to say my aunt had passed away. The news hit me hard. Would ignoring the letter have changed anything? Probably not, but it felt strange. The letters began to sound like commands rather than predictions. "Do not wear your blue shirt tomorrow." I obeyed this time, wearing a gray shirt instead. Nothing significant happened at work, but I worried what would have happened if I wore blue. Another letter. "When you see a green car, cross the street." The next day, I saw a green car parked up ahead. I crossed the street and avoided a large puddle on my original path. If I hadn't crossed, I would have soaked my shoes. The letters were controlling small aspects of my day. I felt trapped. I wanted to refuse their instructions. I tried ignoring them for a few days. A letter said, "Throw away the old umbrella." I didn't. I kept it. The next morning, it rained hard. My old umbrella broke in the wind, flipping inside out and leaving me drenched. By the time I got to work, I was shaking, angry, and wet. Another letter said, "Tell your boss you will leave early." I ignored it. That afternoon I had to work late because of a sudden project. If I had left early, maybe I would have missed the hassle. It seemed the letters guided me to avoid inconveniences or unpleasant events. But why? Who was doing this? I searched every inch of my apartment for hidden cameras or microphones. I found nothing. I changed my locks. I bought a new phone. The letters kept coming. Each time they knew my secrets and my actions. It was like they were inside my head. I considered going to the police, but what would I say? I have letters with no fingerprints or addresses predicting my life. They'd think I was insane. A new letter arrived, more explicit. Tomorrow, at the corner store, pick up the red magazine. I decided to follow this one. The next day, I went to the corner store and looked for a red magazine. I found one about travel destinations. As I picked it up, I noticed a folded piece of paper tucked inside. It was another letter. It read, "Good, you are learning." I felt chills on my neck. They had left a letter outside my home, hidden in a magazine. The letters began to give me more complex instructions. Do not speak to anyone on Wednesday. That was hard. I had co-workers, a boss, but I tried. I faked a sore throat. I nodded and typed replies instead of talking. Wednesday passed quietly. Nothing bad happened, but I felt uneasy all day. Another letter. Call your brother on Friday and say you are sorry. I hadn't spoken to my brother in years. I didn't want to. But Friday morning I gave in. I called him and apologized for the fight we had long ago. He sounded surprised, then grateful. We ended on a good note. That evening's letter said, "Well done." It started to feel like the letters were shaping my life, pushing me towards certain actions, preventing small mishaps, encouraging reconciliations. But I never asked for this guidance. I felt exposed, like my entire life was visible to someone I couldn't see. I grew paranoid. I checked outside my door constantly. Sometimes I slept on the couch with all the lights on. The letters always appeared silently. Sometimes I would blink, and there it would be on the floor. I tested leaving a sheet of paper on the floor to see if they disturbed it. They didn't. They always found a way around my traps. One letter stood out. It said, "Do not answer any knocks at the door after midnight tonight." That night, I stayed up, heart pounding, waiting. Around 1 a.m., I heard a soft knock, then another. I froze. I wanted to answer, to open it and catch whoever was tormenting me. But I remembered the letter's warning. I stood still, barely breathing. The knocks continued, slow and gentle. Then they stopped. In the morning, another letter. "You made the right choice." As weeks passed, I followed the letters more often than not. My life became smoother in a strange way. The letters helped me avoid small dangers, fix old problems, and take unexpected opportunities. But I hated not knowing who controlled me. I hated feeling like a puppet. I tried writing back. I left a note outside my door. "Who are you? Why are you doing this?" The next morning, no reply. The same day, another letter arrived inside my home, as always, ignoring my note. "Do not waste time asking." That was the entire message. I felt a deep anger growing inside me. I wanted to break something, to shout, but I knew no one would respond. I considered moving out. I searched for a new apartment, but I hesitated. What if the letters followed me? Another letter gave me a tough choice. Refuse your boss's request tomorrow. My boss asked me to take on a large project that could lead to a promotion. Against my instincts, I refused. My boss looked shocked, but then admitted he had no budget to pay extra and was testing my patience. He respected my honesty. I realized following the letter had saved me from exploitation. That night, the letter said, "Trust us." I realized I had started thinking of these letters as a them, or us. They gave me no reason to trust. But they had not harmed me. They had only guided me, sometimes in small ways, sometimes big. They knew my secrets and fears. They manipulated me. But I couldn't deny that things were somehow working out better. One day, no letter came. I waited all day. I checked the floor 100 times. Nothing. The next day, also nothing. I felt anxious. Without the letter, how would I know what to do or avoid? I realized I had grown dependent on them. I went about my day, uneasy. I turned right when maybe I should have turned left. Nothing bad happened, but I felt exposed. 3 days passed with no letters. I slept poorly. I kept expecting something terrible to happen. It didn't. I managed fine on my own. On the 4th day, a letter appeared. "You can handle this." I smiled bitterly. They left me alone to show me I could live without them. But why do that? I tested, ignoring the next instruction. The letter said, "Buy green apples today." I bought red apples instead. Nothing happened, except I felt guilty and tense. The following letter said nothing about my choice. It simply read, "We understand." I asked myself who we could be. Maybe it was a group of people, maybe some twisted social experiment, maybe something else entirely, but I never found out. The letters never explained themselves. They only observed, advised, and occasionally demanded. After a few months, the letters became less frequent. They came about once a week, then once every 2 weeks. Each time, a single instruction or a reassurance. "Keep your spare key under the mat today." I did, and later my friend who visited needed to get in when I was late. "Don't forget to pay your bill early." I did, avoiding a surprise fee increase. I tried to live my life normally. I made decisions without the letters. I got closer to my family again. I handled my work with more confidence. The letters started to feel unnecessary. Yet, I never told anyone about them. Who would believe me? One evening, I found a final letter. "No more letters. You have learned." I held it in my shaking hands. Learned what? To trust myself? To accept guidance? To live without fear? I didn't know. After that, no more letters arrived. In the following weeks, I kept checking my floor, hoping maybe one last message would appear. It never did. Slowly, I returned to normal life. I still felt watched sometimes, but I could never prove it. I learned to rely on my own judgment again. I didn't need instructions for every step. I still have a box full of those letters. I can't bring myself to throw them away. They are a reminder of a strange period in my life. They showed me my vulnerabilities, my secrets, my habits. They also helped me avoid some troubles and fix old wounds. I never found out who sent them. I never caught anyone in the act. I never figured out how they knew all those things about me. But in the end, I survived it. I moved on. Sometimes at night, I imagine I'll hear a soft rustle outside my door and find another letter waiting. If that happens, I'm not sure if I'll be relieved or terrified. For now, it's quiet, and I'm on my own. I moved into that apartment a few weeks before the problems began. It was a small place, 1 bedroom, a living room, a tiny kitchen, and a bathroom. The walls were old, the paint peeling in some spots. I decided to fix it up myself. I had a few tools, some plaster, paint, and time on my hands. The apartment was on the 3rd floor of a 4-story building. The neighbors seemed normal. The street outside was quiet at night. At first it seemed like a regular old apartment. The plumbing was a bit noisy. Sometimes I heard pipes rattling when I turned on the water. I ignored it. I turned on some music while I worked and tried to focus on sanding the walls and patching holes. I wanted a clean, fresh look. The landlord didn't mind as long as I didn't tear down anything important. He said, "Do whatever you want, as long as it stays an apartment." On the 2nd or 3rd day of working, I heard a faint tapping sound inside one of the walls. I thought it was just loose pipes, or maybe an old beam settling. The noise was rhythmic. Tap, tap, pause, tap, tap, pause. It sounded too regular to be random. I pressed my ear to the wall. The tapping stopped. I moved away. A few minutes later, it started again. I tried to ignore it. I put on my headphones and focused on my work. By the end of that day, I had finished spackling a few cracks and started painting. The smell of fresh paint covered some of the old, dusty smell of the place. I ate a quick dinner and watched some TV. I couldn't concentrate on the show. I kept hearing soft noises in the background. Little knocks, sometimes a scraping sound. It came from different parts of the wall. I turned off the TV and listened carefully. Silence. After a while, I went to bed. The next morning, I woke up to a sound like a gentle knock on wood, but it was coming from behind the bedroom wall. It was early, maybe 7 in the morning. I got up and checked outside in the hallway. No one was there. I stood in the middle of my living room, listening. The knocking was still there, steady and quiet. I knocked back on the wall. The sound paused, then resumed. That made me uneasy. It felt like something was responding. I decided to open a small section of the wall to check the plumbing or wiring. I chose a spot where I had planned to install a shelf. I carefully cut into the plaster. Dust fell into my eyes. I coughed. I used a flashlight to look inside. It was dark, just empty space between the studs, insulation, some old wiring, and dust. No animals, no pipes knocking, nothing moved. I sealed it back up, feeling stupid. Maybe it was just old pipes after all. That night, the knocking got louder. I could hear it in the living room now, not just the bedroom. It seemed to follow me. When I sat on the couch, I heard it behind me. When I stood by the kitchen sink, I heard it behind that wall. I turned off the lights and tried to pinpoint it. The apartment was dark and quiet. My heart beat faster. The sound felt like it was everywhere. I could hear tapping and knocking, soft but steady, echoing through the walls. I tried turning on all the lights. I walked from room to room. The sound followed, always inside the walls. I tried shouting, "Who's there?" No reply, just that steady tapping. I turned on the TV to drown it out. Eventually, I fell asleep on the couch. The next day, a strange smell filled the apartment. It wasn't paint. It smelled damp and stale, like old clothes left in a wet basement. I opened all the windows. I checked under the sink for mold. I found nothing. I emptied the trash. I cleaned the bathroom. The smell persisted. It clung to the air. As I worked, I could still hear the faint knocking, now mixed with what sounded like soft breathing. I paused to listen. It was quiet, but it sounded like a slow inhale and exhale, almost matching my own breathing. That made my skin crawl. I tried ignoring it. I put on loud music, hoping to distract myself. The smell got worse as the day went on. I couldn't find the source. I checked behind the fridge, under the bed, inside every closet. Nothing. I wiped down surfaces and sprayed air freshener. The smell returned within minutes. It was as if the apartment itself produced it. That evening, I had enough. I decided I would sleep elsewhere. I grabbed my keys and a bag of clothes. I figured I could stay at a friend's place or get a hotel. I walked to the front door and turned the knob. The door wouldn't budge. I checked the lock. It was unlocked. I pulled harder. The door was stuck. I tried putting my shoulder into it, kicking it. It felt like it was jammed from the other side. I peered through the peephole. The hallway was empty. I tried calling the landlord, but my phone had no signal. The Wi-Fi still worked, but I didn't have the landlord's email, and it was late. I tried texting a friend. The messages wouldn't send. I felt panic rising in my chest. I ran to the windows. I was on the 3rd floor. I could see the street below. Cars passed by occasionally. I tried to open the window. It was painted shut. I tried another window, also stuck. I took a hammer and tried to force one open. The wood frame cracked but didn't give. The glass rattled, but I couldn't break it. It felt strangely thick, as if reinforced. I stood in the middle of the room, breathing fast. The knocking in the walls seemed louder now, keeping pace with my own heartbeat. The smell was so strong I gagged. I covered my nose with my shirt. My eyes stung. I tried to think of a logical explanation. Maybe the building had some weird old ventilation system. Maybe the door had warped. But I knew something was very wrong. As I moved through the apartment, I noticed the knocks matched my steps. If I took a step, I'd hear a soft knock following me. When I paused, the knocking paused. When I breathed heavily, the knocking turned into a rhythmic pounding, almost like a pulse. I touched the wall. It felt warm. I pressed my ear against it. I heard a faint wheezing sound, like air moving through a narrow space. I decided to try breaking through a wall to get to another apartment. I picked an interior wall, one that should lead to the hallway or maybe the next unit. I took my hammer and struck it hard. The plaster cracked. I hit it again, creating a hole. A musty odor wafted out. I shined a flashlight inside. It was dark. I saw old insulation and dusty beams. I made the hole bigger, hoping to find a cavity I could crawl through. But after making a hole large enough, I realized there was just another layer of wall behind it, like a double wall with no space in between. I tried another wall. Same thing. There was no way out. The sounds grew louder. Now I could hear them in every wall, every corner. It was like the apartment had a heartbeat. The floor creaked under my weight. The ceiling made soft cracking sounds when I looked up. I felt dizzy. The smell made it hard to breathe. My throat felt dry. My eyes watered. I stumbled to the kitchen and ran the faucet to drink water. The water came out dark for a moment, then cleared. I drank quickly, almost choking. The sound of rushing water in the pipes made the knocking intensify. It was as if the apartment was reacting to me drinking. I turned off the faucet and backed away. My mind raced. I needed to get out. Maybe I could break down the door. I grabbed a crowbar from my tool pile and went to the front door. I wedged it into the frame and pushed. The wood groaned but didn't break. I tried smashing the doorknob with a hammer. The metal dented but held strong. My arms ached. I cursed out loud. The knocking seemed to respond, a series of soft taps echoing my voice. I shouted, "Help!" and banged on the walls. My voice sounded muffled. I wondered if anyone outside could hear me. I shouted again and listened. No response, just my own voice echoing back, dull and flat. I tried calling the landlord again, still no signal. I tried using the Wi-Fi to send a message, but my phone's browser wouldn't load anything. It was like the connection was dead, even though it showed a signal. I turned on the TV, hoping to see something normal. The screen showed static. No channels worked. I tried the radio app on my phone. Just static. I was cut off. Hours passed. I paced the apartment. The knocking turned into a kind of soft thumping in the walls. I noticed it matched my breathing now, not just my steps. If I held my breath, the thumping slowed and became quiet. When I exhaled, it sped up. It felt like the apartment was listening to me, reacting to my presence. The smell was unbearable. I covered my face with a towel. My stomach cramped. I sat on the floor, feeling weak. I looked at the walls. They seemed to bulge slightly, the plaster bending outward. I touched one wall, and it felt like it pulsed under my hand. I jerked back. My heart was pounding. I tried to sleep, hoping this was a nightmare. I lay on the couch, covering myself with a blanket. The knocking never stopped. The smell never faded. I drifted in and out of a half-sleep, dreaming of dark corridors and breathing walls. When I opened my eyes, the lights flickered. The bulb in the ceiling buzzed softly. I got up to check the breaker box. The breaker box was behind a small panel in the hallway. I opened it. Instead of wires, I saw strange pipes and damp insulation. I slammed it shut, terrified. I realized I had to try something drastic. I decided to break through the door with all my strength. I took the crowbar and hammer and attacked the door repeatedly. Wood chips flew, but the core of the door seemed unbreakable. Each time I hit it, I heard a deep groan in the walls, as if I was hurting something. The floor shook slightly. I fell back, panting. The apartment made a wheezing sound, a series of low creaks that sounded like labored breathing. My eyes burned from sweat and fear. I tried to remain calm. I spoke aloud. "I just want to leave. Let me go." I felt foolish talking to an apartment, but I was desperate. The knocking slowed down. For a moment it became gentle tapping again. I stood still, waiting. Nothing changed. The door was still locked, the windows sealed. The smell got even worse. I decided to break a window, no matter how thick it was. I grabbed a metal pipe I had found in a closet. I swung it at the window with all my strength. The glass vibrated but didn't crack. I hit it again and again. My arms ached. The knocking in the wall sped up, matching my frantic attempts. I stopped to catch my breath, and the knocking slowed again. I tried to calm down and think. Every time I tried to escape, the apartment reacted. Maybe it wanted me to stop struggling. I walked slowly to the center of the living room and sat down. I breathed in and out, listening. The knocking matched my rhythm again, like breathing. I stood up and walked to the kitchen. The knocking followed. I backed into the bedroom. The knocking came from there too, in the walls on either side. The apartment felt alive, like it was aware of me. I realized I might not be able to leave. I felt nauseous. I leaned against the wall, my forehead touching the plaster. It felt warm. I could hear a faint hiss, like air passing through. I pounded my fist lightly on the wall. The knocking answered in kind. I stopped. My throat felt tight. I tried one last time to use my phone. I held it near the window, hoping for a signal. Nothing. The Wi-Fi icon was there, but nothing loaded. I thought about smashing my phone out of frustration, but I didn't. I needed to keep some sense of normalcy. Time passed slowly. The lights dimmed slightly, or maybe my eyes were playing tricks. I felt weak from hunger and thirst. I drank more tap water, ignoring the strange taste. The apartment's knocking grew softer, as if it was settling into a gentle rhythm. The smell persisted, but I had grown somewhat used to it, even though it made my stomach turn. I had to accept that I was stuck here. The walls were not normal. I couldn't reach anyone outside. I tried pounding in a pattern, like Morse code, hoping someone would hear. The apartment answered with its own pattern, mocking mine. I shouted again, cried out for help, banged on the door until my hands hurt. Nothing changed. Eventually, I sat down in the corner of the living room, hugging my knees. I watched the walls. They seemed to shift slightly in the dim light. I stayed still and quiet. The knocking slowed to a soft, steady pulse. I realized it matched not just my breathing, but my heartbeat. Each thump felt like it came from inside my chest and from the walls at the same time. I don't know how long I stayed like that. Hours, maybe a whole day. I lost track of time. The clock stopped working. The stove's digital display was blank. The TV was static. My phone battery ran low. I turned it off to save power, even though it was useless. I just sat there, listening, breathing, feeling the apartment breathe with me. No one came. No one answered my screams. The door never opened. I tried less and less to escape. My throat was sore from yelling. My muscles ached from fighting the door and the walls. I felt lightheaded. The knocking sound and the smell were constant companions now, as natural as the air I breathed. The apartment's silence, broken only by the soft, rhythmic sounds, pressed down on me. I waited, hoping something would change. The windows stayed shut, the door stayed stuck, and the walls kept breathing. I had to accept it. I had no choice. It was just me and the apartment now, sharing the same space, breathing together in the dim light. I first noticed the calls about 3 weeks ago. It was early evening. I was sitting on my couch watching TV with a half-empty beer on the coffee table. My phone rang. I glanced at the screen. The number had no name, just a set of digits that looked odd. I answered, expecting a wrong number or a telemarketer. On the other end, I heard static, just heavy static, no voice. I said hello a few times, got no response. After a few seconds, a faint whisper broke through, but I couldn't make out any words. Then the call ended. I shrugged it off and finished my beer. I didn't think much of it then. The next day, the same number called around the same time. This time, the static was heavier, crackling in my ear. I said hello again. A voice tried to speak through the noise. I caught fragments. My name, Mark, and something else I couldn't understand. It sounded forced, like someone struggling to form words through a bad signal. I asked who it was, but the call ended again. That unsettled me. How did they know my name? I decided to call back. I tried the number. A recorded message said this number was no longer in service. That confused me. How could a deadline call me? I checked my phone's log. The number matched exactly. I tried a reverse lookup online, found nothing. I felt a bit uneasy, but told myself it was a glitch. Maybe some old automated system was messed up. 2 days later, the calls started coming more often. Always the same number, always static and a faint voice. Once, I swear I heard my own voice repeated back to me, like it echoed something I had said a few minutes earlier in my apartment. I had been talking to myself, complaining about my job. The call came right after, and through the static, I heard a distorted version of my complaint. That made my skin crawl. I hung up immediately. I tried blocking the number. The next night, my phone rang again from a similar number, off by 1 digit. Same static, same whispering voice. It said a phrase I had spoken under my breath earlier that day. I had cursed my boss at lunch, and now I heard my own words repeated back, twisted by static. I felt my heart pound. How the hell was this happening? I decided to unplug my phone and use only my cell. But the calls came to my cell now, same issue. Then they started reaching my landline at work. I didn't even know my desk phone could receive outside calls like that. I tried picking up at work and got the same static and faint voice. My coworkers looked at me funny as I said, "Hello?" into a silent office phone. I hung up quickly and pretended it was a wrong number. The calls kept coming, sometimes multiple times a day. Always static, always some faint words that matched my recent speech. It was as if someone recorded me secretly and then played it back distorted. I started checking my apartment for hidden devices. I searched every corner, under the bed, behind the TV, inside cabinets. I found nothing. I tried turning off all electronics. I still got calls. One afternoon, I finally made out a clear phrase. The voice said, "Look behind you." I spun around, heart racing, expecting to see someone in my living room. Nothing, just my bookshelf and a lamp. I slammed the phone down and paced the room, breathing hard. My chest felt tight. From that day on, the voice got clearer with each call. The static remained, but I could understand more words. It never identified itself. Instead, it started giving me instructions. Small things at first. Do not open the window. I froze, looked at my closed window. I hadn't planned to open it. I ignored the command. Another call. Don't answer the door. A minute later, someone knocked. I looked through the peephole, saw the mailman with a package. I opened the door anyway. Nothing bad happened, but I felt defiant, like I was resisting whoever was behind this. But the next call was angry. The voice hissed my name, and static flared loudly. It repeated, "Look at the corner" 4 times, each time more distorted. I looked at the corner of my living room. Nothing there. I shouted into the phone, "What do you want from me?" The call ended abruptly. I tried calling the phone company, the police, anyone who might help. The phone company said the number didn't exist. The police didn't take me seriously. They said it was probably a prank. I had no proof and no idea how to explain it. My friends said I was stressed. They joked about ghost callers. I stopped mentioning it. I felt isolated, dealing with this alone. The calls escalated. The voice started telling me to do things at specific times. At 7 p.m., turn off your TV. I ignored it. At 7 p.m., my TV popped loudly, as if short-circuited, and went black. I tried turning it on again, but it was dead. Another call. Do not eat lunch at noon. I laughed and ate lunch at noon anyway. 15 minutes later, I felt sick. I spent the rest of the afternoon in the bathroom at work. Coincidence? I didn't think so. This thing, whatever it was, could influence my environment. It knew what I said, what I did, and punished me if I disobeyed. That terrified me. I decided to comply with its instructions to see if that helped. For a while, I did what it said. Don't answer the phone at 3 p.m. I let it ring while I stared at the caller ID. Another weird number. After it stopped ringing, I felt relieved I obeyed. Nothing bad happened that day. Maybe it was testing me, but I couldn't live like that. It was controlling my life. The voice grew more confident, giving more bizarre commands. Throw out your red shirt. I did it, just to stay safe. Do not speak to your boss today. I avoided my boss, and my boss left early. The next day, the voice said, check under your sink. I looked and found a leak in the pipe that could have flooded my kitchen. It saved me that time. Strange. I began to suspect it was not just harassing me. Sometimes it helped. Sometimes it warned me about small dangers. But it also spied on me and repeated my private words. I tried talking to it calmly during a call. Who are you? I asked. The static crackled. I heard my own voice repeated back, who are you? Then the call ended. One night I sat in the dark with my phone in hand waiting. I said out loud, I will do what you say if you tell me what you want. Almost immediately my phone rang. The voice said, look outside. I got up and looked out the window. On the street, a car sped by too fast. I heard a crash a block away. The next call said, you are safe inside. I couldn't tell if it was boasting or reassuring me. I tried ignoring the calls again, not picking up. They came through different devices. My computer speakers crackled once, producing that static and faint voice. I yanked the speaker cable out. My TV, before it died, turned on by itself and produced static that sounded like whispering. I unplugged it. My old radio alarm clock woke me up at 3 a.m. with static and that voice whispering my name. I threw the clock in the trash. It was everywhere. I started to panic. I considered leaving my apartment, staying with a friend. But I feared it would follow me. At least here I knew what to expect. One evening, I tried leaving anyway. I took my phone and a suitcase, planning to stay at a motel. As soon as I stepped into the hallway, my phone rang. I answered. The voice said, "Stay." Just that one word. I felt a sudden tightness in my chest, like I couldn't breathe. I gasped, staggered back into my apartment, and as soon as I closed the door, I could breathe again. It had control over me somehow. I dropped the suitcase and slumped to the floor, tears in my eyes. I became desperate. I searched online for similar stories. I found nothing credible. I posted on forums, got mocked. I smashed one of my phones, but the calls came through the replacement anyway. I tried removing the battery at night. They called on my work line instead. I couldn't escape. One morning, the voice said something new. "Look behind." I turned around in my kitchen. I saw a shape flicker in the corner of my eye, near the fridge. I jumped, nearly dropping the phone. The voice whispered, "We watch." My stomach twisted. I shouted, "Why are you doing this?" The voice repeated, "We watch," then static. The call ended. From that point on, I often felt watched, even when not on the phone. I felt eyes on my back, heard faint static in quiet rooms. I hardly slept. I stopped cooking because I was afraid of a command telling me to do something dangerous. I ate canned food cold. I avoided talking to myself, afraid my words would appear in the next call. I kept my home silent. The calls still came, but now the voice gave fewer instructions and more eerie statements. "We know your past. We see your thoughts. Don't resist." Each time I felt weaker, more exhausted. I lost weight and looked pale. My coworkers asked if I was sick. I just mumbled excuses. Then one night I received a different kind of instruction. At midnight, turn off all lights and wait by the door. I didn't want to do it, but I felt compelled. Midnight came. I turned off every light, stood by the front door, trembling. Minutes passed. My phone buzzed with a message. "Open the door." I opened it slowly. The hallway was empty and dark. I stepped outside, my heart pounding. The phone in my hand crackled. The voice said, "Go downstairs." I walked down the stairs in darkness, guided only by the faint emergency exit sign. I reached the lobby. It was empty. Another call. "Go outside." I pushed the lobby door open and stepped onto the sidewalk. The street was quiet, no cars, no people. It felt like time had stopped. The voice whispered, "Look left." I looked left. Nothing but empty road. "Look right." I looked right. I saw a payphone on the corner, something I never noticed before. It rang, a shrill sound cutting the silence. I approached the payphone. My cell was still in my hand, but now silent. I picked up the receiver, the same static, the same voice. "We know you," it said clearly. "We guide you." I felt tears on my cheeks. My lips trembled. "Please," I said, "leave me alone." The voice replied, "No, you belong to this." The static grew louder, almost painful. I held the receiver away from my ear. Then suddenly the static cut off. The line went dead. I stood there in the cold night air, holding a silent payphone receiver. My cell phone rang again. I checked the screen, the old number. I answered, my voice shaking. "What do you want?" The voice was barely a whisper now. It said, "Look behind you." I spun around, expecting something horrible. I saw nothing but my empty apartment building's entrance. When I turned back, the payphone was gone. It wasn't there, just an empty sidewalk. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping my phone. My head spun. I ran back inside, up the stairs, into my apartment, locked the door. I checked my call logs. The calls from that strange number were all gone, as if erased. My phone showed no recent calls. I stood in my living room, breathing hard, trying to understand. The TV, the radio, my work phone, all silent. I waited, expecting another call. Nothing. I waited hours, sitting on the couch in the dark, my eyes on the phone. No ring, no static. In the following days, no more calls came. My devices worked normally. I tested my phone lines. Everything was fine. I watched TV, no strange voices. I checked under the sink, behind the fridge, found nothing unusual. It took me weeks to relax. I never found out who or what caused those calls. They vanished as suddenly as they started. I still feel uneasy sometimes, expecting my phone to ring and that static voice to return. But it remains silent. Maybe I passed some test, or maybe it grew bored and left me alone. I keep my phone on silent now, just in case. If it ever starts again, I'm not sure what I'd do differently. I just know I never want to hear that static and that whispering voice again. For now, I live quietly, trying to forget the strange days when a dead number called me, watched me, controlled me, and then disappeared without explanation. I noticed the umbrellas a few weeks after I started taking the train each morning. They were always in the same spot, tucked into a corner near the benches on the east side of the platform. At first, I didn't pay much attention to them. People left things at the station sometimes. Usually they disappeared after a day or two. But these umbrellas never moved. There were maybe 5 or 6 of them, all different colors and styles, leaning against the wall. They were dusty and damp from the morning mist. I commuted early, catching the 6:30 a.m. train. The platform was quiet at that hour. I would stand near the umbrellas, waiting for my train, sipping coffee and checking the time on my phone. Some days it rained, and I wondered why nobody claimed those umbrellas. They seemed abandoned. Still, it felt odd that the cleaning staff or station attendants never took them away. They just stayed there, day after day. One morning, it was pouring rain. I had forgotten my own umbrella at home. I stood there, getting damp despite the station's partial roof. My train was late, and I was cold and annoyed. Without thinking much, I walked over and picked one of the umbrellas. It was black with a wooden handle. It looked old but sturdy. I held it up, tested it. It seemed fine. I told myself I would just borrow it. I would bring it back the next day or leave it there after I got home. The train arrived, and I stepped on board, the umbrella in my hand. On the train, I felt a bit guilty, but I tried to justify it. Nobody had claimed them for weeks. Maybe they were abandoned. Maybe the owner never returned. I would return it anyway, so it wasn't stealing, right? I reached my stop, opened the umbrella outside, and walked to my office. It was quiet. I felt normal. No one commented on it. That evening, I took the same umbrella home. By then, the rain had stopped. I decided I would take it back the next morning. At home, I opened it to let it dry. Inside, I noticed a small name carved into the wooden handle, Elias. I didn't know anyone by that name. The carving looked old, the letters uneven. I ran my finger over it. It gave me a slight chill, but I told myself it was just a random name. The next day, I woke up late. I rushed out without the umbrella, completely forgetting about my promise to return it. By the time I remembered, I was already on the train. I felt a twinge of regret. I told myself I'd bring it tomorrow. That afternoon, I left work and walked home. It was cloudy but not raining. I felt a strange sensation, as if someone was watching me. I glanced over my shoulder a few times. The street was mostly empty. A couple walked by on the opposite sidewalk. A man in a hooded jacket stood near a bus stop, checking his phone. Nothing unusual, but I couldn't shake the feeling. When I got home, I went straight to the umbrella. I picked it up and looked at it carefully. Just a normal black umbrella with Elias scratched into the handle. I noticed a faint smell of damp fabric. The metal ribs were a bit rusty. I folded it and placed it by the front door, determined to return it the next day. That night, I woke up around 3 a.m. I had the urge to check my front door. I can't explain why. I got up, barefoot, and walked quietly through my apartment. I looked through the peephole. The hallway was dimly lit. Nothing moved. I listened for a moment. Silence. I returned to bed, feeling foolish. The following morning, I carried the umbrella with me to the station. It was not raining, but I held it anyway. I planned to leave it where I found it. As I approached the platform, I looked toward the corner where the umbrellas used to be. They were gone. The space was empty, the wall bare. No dust, no sign they had ever been there. My stomach tightened. I stood there, umbrella in hand, unsure what to do. I didn't want to just leave it in some random place. I decided to hold on to it until after work. Maybe I would ask the station attendant, but the attendant booth was empty that morning. During the day, I felt uneasy. My mind returned to the umbrellas. Why had they vanished overnight? Who took them? I left work a bit earlier than usual, deciding to go back to the station and ask someone in charge. When I reached the platform, I found a maintenance worker sweeping. I asked about the umbrellas that used to be in the corner. He shrugged and said he never saw any umbrellas there. I insisted I saw them for weeks. He just shook his head and moved on. I felt angry and confused. That night on the way home, I noticed that when I passed dark corners, I felt that same sense of being watched. I tried to ignore it, walking quickly. At home, I locked my door and sat with the umbrella on my lap. I looked for any other markings. Inside, near one of the ribs, I found a small slip of paper tucked into the fabric. It was damp and almost illegible. It said, "This is not yours." My heart jumped. Someone had left a note inside? I stood up, adrenaline pumping. I checked my windows and door. Everything locked. The note was short, just those 4 words, scrawled in pen. It looked old, the ink blurred. I wondered how long it had been there. Maybe I missed it before. I told myself I would get rid of the umbrella, just throw it out or leave it somewhere. But something stopped me. I felt like that would be a bad idea. Instead, I placed it in my closet and went to bed. The next morning, I noticed a subtle change. The umbrella wasn't in my closet where I left it. It leaned against my living room wall. I was sure I put it in the closet. My heart pounded. Was someone in my apartment? I checked every room, every corner. Nothing. Windows locked, door locked. I felt dizzy. I took the umbrella and left, planning to discard it in a trash bin far from home. On my way out, I saw a neighbor. I said hello, trying to act normal. Down the block, I found a large dumpster behind a store. I threw the umbrella inside, closed the lid, and walked away. My hands shook. I felt relief. It was gone. That evening, I arrived home after work. I stepped inside and flicked on the light. The umbrella stood in the hallway, near my shoes. I froze. My vision blurred. I struggled to breathe. How could it be here again? I grabbed it, furious, and shouted, "Who's doing this?" My voice echoed in the empty apartment. I examined the handle again. The name Elias looked deeper, as if freshly carved. I tried scratching at it with my fingernail. The letters would not fade. I looked closely at the fabric and found another note pinned under a rib. "You should not have taken it." The handwriting was the same, shaky and rough. I spent the rest of the night searching online for any clue. Lost and found items at the station, incidents involving umbrellas, anything. I found nothing useful. I barely slept. Over the next few days, the feeling of being watched intensified. On my way to the station, I noticed the same individuals appearing in my peripheral vision. A woman with a gray coat, standing too still near the entrance. A man in a hat, holding a newspaper upside down. Each time I looked directly at them, they moved away, disappearing into the crowd. I tried leaving the umbrella at the station again. I placed it against the wall where I originally found the others. Then I stepped back and watched from a distance. People passed by without noticing it. I waited 10 minutes, staring at it. Suddenly, a train arrived, and a rush of people flooded the platform, blocking my view. When they cleared, the umbrella was gone. I exhaled, relieved. Maybe this time it would stay gone. That night I came home, opened my door, and found the umbrella on my kitchen table. My knees almost gave out. I hadn't locked my door. I checked the lock. It was intact. I touched the umbrella's handle. The wood felt colder than before, almost wet. I decided to call a friend. I told him I was having a weird problem. I didn't mention the supernatural part. I just said someone kept returning an umbrella I tried to get rid of. He laughed and said I should install a camera. Great idea. I bought a cheap camera and set it up in my living room, pointing at the front door. That night, I tried sleeping. Around 2 a.m., I heard a soft thump in the living room. I rushed out of bed and turned on the lights. The umbrella had moved from the kitchen table to the floor near the door. I checked my camera footage. The camera showed no movement, no one entering. Just a slight flicker. Then the umbrella appeared in a new position. I felt sick to my stomach. I realized I was dealing with something I couldn't explain. It was tied to that station, to those umbrellas, to the name Elias. I thought about going to the station in the middle of the night, but it closed after the last train. Maybe I could wait until the first morning train, bring it there at dawn. I took a few days off work. I stayed home, hardly eating. The umbrella moved around my apartment. Sometimes I found it in the bathroom, other times by my bed. Once I woke up and it was right next to me on the mattress. I screamed and threw it across the room. I shouted, "What do you want?" No answer, just silence. On my third day off, I decided to try one last thing. I waited until evening, then took the umbrella and headed to the station. I didn't care about the strange watchers anymore. I wanted this done. The platform was nearly empty. I placed the umbrella on the exact spot where I first saw the collection. I spoke quietly. "I'm sorry. I didn't know." Then I backed away. A single train arrived, empty except for a conductor. After it left, the platform was silent. I looked back at the umbrella. Next to it, I noticed a small piece of paper that wasn't there before. I approached slowly. The note read, "You cannot return what you have taken." My heart sank. I tried to pick up the umbrella again, but it felt heavier, almost glued to the ground. I pulled hard. It came loose, but my hands felt numb. I walked home, umbrella in hand, tears in my eyes. I felt helpless. At my door, I found another note taped to the frame. "Your name is not inside." I tore it down and entered. Inside, I saw muddy footprints leading from the door to my bedroom. I followed them, shaking. They ended at my closet. I opened it, braced for the worst. Nothing inside but clothes and empty hangers. When I turned around, the umbrella was leaning against my bed again, even though I left it at the front door. I collapsed onto a chair, exhausted. I realized I might never get rid of it. It seemed attached to me now. The notes, the watchers, the strange appearances, all hinted that I broke some rule by taking something that wasn't mine. Those other umbrellas had vanished, and mine remained. Maybe they were claimed by their true owners before. Maybe I was supposed to leave it alone. As days passed, I learned to live with it. The umbrella stayed in the apartment, following me around silently. The notes stopped appearing. The watchers at the station disappeared. I stopped trying to return it or throw it away. It just wouldn't leave. I never used it again, never opened it. It stood in a corner, watching me as I ate, slept, and went about my routine. Sometimes I woke at night and heard a soft rustling sound. I would find the umbrella in a different spot. I stopped screaming or asking questions. It gave no answers. Eventually, I moved out of that apartment, leaving the umbrella behind. I locked the door and left the key with the landlord. I never explained anything. I moved across town, found a new place, avoided that station. Sometimes I dreamed of umbrellas lined up against a wall, waiting. In my dreams, I see a note that says, "You shouldn't have taken it," and I wake up sweating. I don't know if it's still there in that old apartment. I don't know if it followed the next tenant or if it finally disappeared. I only know I learned a hard lesson. Some things are better left untouched. Now, on rainy days, I carry my own umbrella, never borrowing one from anywhere. I keep my eyes forward at the station, never looking into corners or abandoned items. I don't want to invite something like that back into my life. I first saw the mirror on a Saturday morning. I had no reason to be at that antique shop. I had been wandering around my neighborhood looking for a gift for an old friend. I noticed the shop because of its window display. It looked cramped and messy, with many old paintings stacked against each other. There was also a tall, narrow mirror leaning against the window from the inside. It caught my eye because it looked expensive and old, with a heavy wooden frame and detailed carvings along the edges. It reminded me of something I might see in an old movie. I stepped inside the shop without much thought. The shop was silent, except for a faint humming sound coming from somewhere behind the shelves. The place smelled like dust, old paper, and worn fabric. I moved between the furniture and shelves, noticing chipped porcelain, faded photographs, and old lampshades. I found the mirror at the back, propped up against a corner, half hidden behind a wooden chest. It was larger and heavier than I expected. Its glass was clean, but something about it felt off. When I stood in front of it, I saw the room behind me. I saw the chest, a small stool, some boxes, but I did not see my own reflection. I leaned in and turned around a few times, but I still couldn't see myself in it. The mirror showed everything else: the dust on the floor, the cracks in the wall, and the other items behind me. It just didn't show me. I asked the shopkeeper about it. He was an older man with thin hair and a tired face. He shrugged and said he didn't know where the mirror came from. It had arrived as part of a lot he bought at an estate sale. He said maybe it was defective or had some quirk in the glass. He didn't seem interested in discussing it. He named a price that was surprisingly low. I felt curious enough to buy it, even though I had no idea why I wanted such a strange object. I brought it home the same day. I lived alone in a small apartment on the second floor of a quiet building. There was a spot in my hallway where I thought the mirror would fit. I leaned it against the wall and stared at it. In its reflection, I could see the opposite wall, a small table, and a lamp. Again, I could see everything except myself. It bothered me, but I also felt drawn to it, as if it promised some answer or secret. That night, I went to bed feeling uneasy, but also curious. The next day, I noticed something strange. When I passed by the mirror in the morning, I saw a new object in its reflection. It looked like an old pendulum clock. It stood where my table should be, except I could still see my actual table behind me. In reality, there was no clock. Only in the mirror's reflection did I see it. I moved closer and reached out, touching the air in front of me. Nothing was there. Yet, in the mirror, the clock looked solid and heavy. I walked around my apartment, checking every room. I didn't own a pendulum clock. I'd never bought one. When I returned to the mirror, The clock was still there in the reflection. Over the next few days, more objects appeared in the reflection. I saw an armchair with a patterned cushion, a small vase with fresh flowers, and a dark wooden table that I didn't recognize. None of these objects were actually in my apartment. They existed only in the mirror's reflection. Each time I passed by the mirror, I noticed some new detail. The arrangement seemed to form a small room inside the mirror. I didn't know how to explain it. It made no sense, but I couldn't deny what I was seeing. Then, one morning, I woke up and found a pendulum clock in my living room. It stood against the wall, ticking softly. I froze and stared at it. It hadn't been there before. I touched it, felt its weight, heard its mechanism. It was real. That same afternoon, I found an armchair in my bedroom, the same one I had seen in the reflection. The next day, the vase appeared on my kitchen counter. It had fresh flowers, the same as in the reflection. I felt a tightness in my chest. I didn't want these objects. They didn't match my furniture. I didn't understand how they got there. I kept my doors locked. My windows were closed. No one had a spare key. I lived alone. Yet these items were appearing one by one. I tried ignoring them, but every morning there was something new. Eventually, my apartment looked like a strange mix of my own belongings and these foreign objects. It unsettled me. I decided to do something about the mirror. I tried to cover it with a sheet. I wanted to stop seeing that impossible reflection. As soon as I placed the sheet over the mirror, I heard something. It sounded like footsteps, soft but distinct. I whipped around, thinking someone had entered my apartment, but I saw nothing. I checked my doors again. Locked. Windows were locked too. The footsteps continued. They seemed to come from behind the mirror, but there was nothing behind it except the wall. My heartbeat sped up. I couldn't ignore it. I pulled the sheet off again. The footsteps stopped. The mirror's reflection was now just the hallway behind me, but it felt off somehow. The light seemed dimmer in the reflection. I tried moving the mirror to another room. Maybe it would help. I dragged it into my living room and leaned it against a different wall. Now, when I looked into it, I saw something else. I saw a room that I did not recognize at all. It wasn't my apartment. It looked larger. I saw wooden floors, a small rug, a table with a lamp I had never seen. The reflection didn't show my living room. It showed another place entirely. I blinked and moved aside, trying to see if the angle changed. It didn't. The mirror no longer reflected my apartment at all. I wanted to throw it away, but it was heavy and valuable. Also, I was afraid of what would happen if I tried. There was a feeling in the pit of my stomach. I didn't want to bring it outside. I didn't want others to see it. I considered calling the police or a friend, but I didn't know how to explain this. Who would believe me? The next day, I woke up early. I heard soft music or something similar. I got up and realized it came from near the living room. I walked in and found the mirror uncovered. I had left it uncovered the previous night. The reflection showed the same strange room. Now I could see more details. There was a door in that room. It looked old and made of dark wood. I saw a small painting on the wall. The furniture looked worn but clean. I stared at it for a while. Then I noticed the slightest movement inside the reflection. It was a shadow or a shape passing by. I leaned closer, my heart pounding. I saw no one, but I felt a presence. Over the next few days, I became obsessed with watching this reflection. It changed slightly each day. Sometimes there were new objects inside the reflected room. Sometimes items that had appeared in my apartment were now visible inside that reflection, as if they had been taken from my home and placed there. I also noticed that time passed differently. The light inside the reflection did not match the time of day. Sometimes it looked like afternoon in there, even though it was night in my apartment. I tried covering the mirror again. This time, I used a thick blanket and taped it to the wall. I wanted silence and darkness. But after a few hours, I heard the footsteps again. They were louder this time. They moved back and forth behind the mirror. I also heard a faint knocking sound. I stood in front of the covered mirror, my hands shaking. I didn't want to remove the blanket, but I couldn't stand the noise. I ripped the blanket down, and the noise stopped. The reflection returned. Now, the door inside the reflected room was slightly open. I couldn't remember if it had been closed before, but it felt like it had been. I started losing sleep. I felt nervous all the time. I ate little, and I paced around my apartment. The new objects that appeared had stopped arriving, but my place still looked wrong. I decided to get rid of the mirror once and for all. I called a friend and told him I needed help moving something. I didn't mention the mirror's strange behavior. He came over on a Tuesday afternoon. When he arrived, I noticed he looked pale and nervous. He stood in the hallway, looked at the mirror, and asked me what was wrong with it. I asked what he meant. He said he felt uneasy around it. He refused to help me move it, said he had a stomach ache, and left in a hurry. I stood alone, furious and scared. That evening, I tried sliding the mirror towards the door. It was too heavy. The frame dug into the floor. At one point, my grip slipped and the mirror nearly fell. I caught it in time, but something on the other side of the mirror thumped back. I yelped and jumped back. I let go. The mirror settled back against the wall. I heard a low scraping sound from within the reflection. I looked in and saw nothing moving, but now the door in the reflected room was wide open. Inside the door frame, I saw darkness. Nothing else. I felt sweat on my forehead. My hands shook. I tried to speak aloud, but my voice came out weak. I said, "Stop." Nothing happened. I said it again, louder. Silence. I stared at the reflection, waiting for something to happen. After a few minutes, I walked away and sat in my bedroom, staring at the wall. I left the lights on. I checked my phone several times, thinking about calling someone. But who? The police wouldn't believe me. I'd sound crazy. Over the next few hours, I went back to the mirror several times. Each time, the reflected room looked a little different. The light changed. Objects moved. I thought I saw footprints on the floor there. I noticed a small rocking chair that hadn't been there before. I also started to feel something. It was a strange pressure in my chest whenever I stood close to the mirror. It was like the air was denser near it. My breathing got shallow. My pulse raced. At midnight, I sat on the floor in front of the mirror with the lights off. I wanted to see if something would happen if I waited quietly. The reflection was faint now, as if lit by a single dim lamp. After a while, I noticed a shape standing in the doorway inside the reflection. It looked like a person. I couldn't make out details. It did not move much, but I saw a slight sway. My heart hammered. I wanted to get up and run, but I stayed, hoping it was my imagination. Then I heard a soft scraping sound again. It sounded like footsteps on a wooden floor. The figure in the reflection stepped back into the darkness and vanished. I got up and turned on the lights. I decided to try something else. I tried turning the mirror to face the wall. I pushed with all my strength until the mirror's reflective surface faced the wall and the back of the mirror faced the room. I stood there, breathing heavily. The footsteps started again, louder this time. They circled behind me. I spun around, expecting to see someone in the room. There was no one. I felt a chill on my neck. I pulled the mirror back to face the room. The footsteps stopped. The reflected room returned. Now, the door inside the reflection was closed again. The next morning, I woke up feeling drawn to the mirror. I didn't want to be, but I couldn't stop myself. I moved closer, stood before it, and tried to examine every inch of the reflection. The room inside looked quiet. The door was closed. The furniture was still. I noticed something strange. The reflection now showed a spot on the floor that resembled the exact place I was standing. It wasn't my floor, but the boards looked similar. I couldn't explain it. It was as if the reflection had adapted to show a place that aligned with where I stood. I reached out and touched the glass. It felt cold and smooth. Nothing unusual. I pressed harder. Still nothing. I stepped away and sat down. After a while, I stood up and leaned in again. I placed both hands on the frame and looked closely at the corner of the reflection. I saw a tiny detail, a small scratch on the wooden floor inside the reflection that matched one on my own floor. I panicked. It felt like the two spaces were blending together. By late afternoon, I felt exhausted. I wanted to sleep, but I couldn't stop thinking about the mirror. I hovered near it, trying to see if anything changed. Eventually, I lay down on my couch, which faced the mirror. I watched the reflection from a distance. The room inside remained quiet, but the atmosphere in my apartment felt tense. The silence was thick. At dusk, I heard a creak. I sat up. The mirror's reflection showed that the door in the reflected room was slowly swinging open again. My heart pounded. I stood and approached the mirror. As I got closer, I felt a strange pull. It felt like stepping into a thick fog. My vision blurred for a moment. I blinked and shook my head. When I looked again, I saw the door inside was fully open. Beyond it, I saw a hallway. It looked similar to my own hallway, but empty. I could smell a faint odor coming from somewhere, like old wood. I don't know why I did it, but I pressed my hand against the glass again. This time, I felt the glass give slightly. My fingertips sank in a fraction of an inch, as if the surface had softened. I gasped and pulled back. My heart was racing. I tried again, and the glass felt solid. I stepped back and paced around my living room, breathing fast. I had no explanation for any of this. I realized I needed to leave. I grabbed my keys and rushed out the door. I wandered around the block, breathing fresh air. I considered calling the shopkeeper, but I doubted he'd know what to do. After some time, I returned. It was dark now. The apartment was quiet. I turned on all the lights. The mirror was still there, showing the strange room. The door inside it was open, and I could see the hallway beyond. I felt a sensation of being watched. I moved closer, feeling my breath getting shallow and my muscles tense. I extended my hand again. This time, the glass felt different. I pushed gently, and my fingertips slipped through. I jerked my hand back. My skin felt cold, but unharmed. I tried again, pushing my whole hand. It passed through the surface without resistance. On the other side, I felt air and empty space. I could hear a faint echo of my own breathing. My hand looked normal, just partially inside the mirror. I had a choice: leave my apartment and never return, or see what was inside that reflected space. I felt a strange compulsion to enter. My mind was screaming to stop, but my body acted on its own. I leaned forward, pressing my shoulder, then my head, through the mirror. I took a step, and my foot found a solid floor on the other side. I slipped through, leaving my apartment behind. I stood in a dimly lit hallway. The walls were blank. There was a door behind me, which I guessed led back to my apartment. But when I turned around, I saw only darkness. The mirror was gone. I tried stepping back, but I hit a solid wall. I reached forward, touching the wood. I felt trapped. I heard footsteps in the darkness ahead. They were slow and deliberate. I stood there, unable to move, my heart pounding so hard that I thought I would faint. I called out, but my voice sounded dull and empty. The footsteps approached. I backed against the wall, pressing my palms flat, searching for a way out. I felt no seams, no gaps. The air was stale and cold. The footsteps stopped close by. I felt a presence. I reached out in front of me, feeling nothing. I heard a breath, not mine. I tried to scream, but only a faint gasp came out. My body shook. My skin felt clammy. My legs felt weak. I closed my eyes, hoping that when I opened them, I'd see my apartment again. But I remained in darkness, trapped with something unseen. The last thing I remember is a soft scraping sound next to my ear and my own heartbeat pounding in my head. Stepped into the convenience store about 5 minutes before closing time. I was on my way home. I needed a pack of batteries for my flashlight and maybe something to drink. The sign on the door said open until midnight. The place looked normal from outside. The lights were on, the shelves were stocked. Everything seemed fine. I expected the usual hum of a refrigerator and maybe some quiet music, or at least the sound of the clerk cleaning up. Instead, I heard nothing. The air inside felt stale and heavy. I walked past the first aisle and looked toward the register. I didn't see anyone there, no clerk, no customer, no sign of movement. I stood near the entrance, holding the door open with my shoulder and called out, "Hello?" No answer. I released the door. It closed behind me with a soft click. I stepped forward, expecting someone to appear from the back room. The place was silent. I noticed the lights overhead flickering slightly. They were those cheap fluorescent tubes that sometimes hum, but I heard no hum. The silence pressed against my ears. I tried calling again. "Hey, anyone here?" I felt a small knot in my stomach when no one replied. There were at least 5 aisles, filled with chips, candy, and basic groceries. The coolers at the back had drinks and sandwiches. Everything looked normal, yet no one was around. I walked over to the counter. There was an old intercom system on the wall behind it. The register was closed, no money visible. A newspaper lay on the counter, dated that same day. I tapped the counter with my fingertips, waiting for someone to appear. Still nothing. I decided to grab the batteries and leave some money on the counter. That felt wrong, but I didn't want to steal, and I didn't want to stay long in this empty store. I headed to the electronics section, which was a small rack in the back corner. On the way, I heard something, a faint voice. It sounded distant, like someone saying my name. I froze, held my breath. The voice was gone. Maybe I imagined it. I walked faster now, feeling my skin prickling. I found the batteries, picked a pack of AA, and moved toward the drink coolers for a soda. As I opened a cooler door, I heard my name again, clearer this time. It was a whisper, but it came from somewhere near the front of the store. I turned and hurried back to the register area. The store was still empty. I leaned over the counter and looked into the back room through a half-open door. I saw shelves with boxes, a mop bucket, and a small desk. No one there. I called out again, louder this time. "Hello? I'm just trying to buy something." My voice sounded too loud in the silence. No response. I decided to leave. This was too strange. I walked to the entrance and pulled on the door. It didn't move. I tried pushing. Nothing. I looked for a lock. The door had a simple push bar and a deadbolt above it, which looked unlocked. I put my shoulder into it. Still no movement. The door didn't budge at all. I checked the hinges. They looked normal. I tried the door again, harder this time, grunting. It felt like pushing against a wall. Panic rose in my chest. I stepped back and looked around for another exit. There was a door marked "Employees Only" at the back near the storeroom. I hurried there. This door was locked tight. No give at all when I tried the knob. I looked for windows. The only windows were at the front, large panes of glass. I saw the street outside. Cars passed occasionally, headlights sweeping across the glass. I could see the sidewalk, the lamp post. Everything looked normal outside, but the door wouldn't open. I banged on the glass, yelling at a passing person outside. The person walked by without looking in. I yelled louder, hit the glass harder. No reaction. It was as if I didn't exist. I looked at my phone. No signal. The battery icon was still good, but no calls would connect. No messages would send. I turned the flashlight on and off, testing something, but that made no difference. I put the phone away and took a deep breath. I needed to keep calm. I told myself maybe the door was stuck and the clerk went out for a moment. Maybe it would open later. I walked to the intercom on the wall behind the counter and pressed a button. It clicked, but no sound came out. Maybe I needed to do something else. I left it alone. As I turned around, I heard my name again. This time it came through the store's intercom speakers. My name crackled softly, as if someone whispered it directly into a microphone. I spun around looking for a speaker. I saw a small speaker grill on the ceiling above aisle 2. I moved closer, and the sound stopped. My heart was beating fast. My forehead felt damp with sweat. I wiped it with my sleeve. I picked a random aisle and walked down it, looking at the products. Everything seemed normal. Chips, candy bars, canned soup, nothing unusual. I bent down and picked up a candy bar, just to feel something real in my hands. It was solid, normal weight. I put it back. I stepped onto another aisle, listened for footsteps, breathing, anything. Silence. I tried to calm down and think logically. Maybe this was some prank. Maybe someone locked me in and was messing with me. I shouted, "This isn't funny. Let me out." My voice echoed back to me. No answer. I walked to the back of the store again. I tried all the doors. They were locked. The windows were too high and small in the storeroom to crawl out of, and they looked barred from outside. I checked every corner, every possible exit. No luck. The lights flickered again. I noticed the slight buzz of the refrigerators now. At least there was some sound. I opened one of the refrigerator doors and closed it, just to break the silence. As I turned toward the register again, I heard breathing, soft and rhythmic, coming through the intercom. It matched my own breathing at first, then it changed speed, becoming faster than mine. I stopped breathing to see if it would continue. It did. It was someone else's breath, not mine. I shouted, "Who's there?" No answer, just that breathing sound. I ran back to the front door and slammed against it with my shoulder. It hurt my arm. The door didn't move. I tried kicking it. The sound echoed through the store. Still no movement. I looked at the floor and saw something new, a piece of paper with writing. I swear it wasn't there before. I picked it up and held it under the overhead light. The handwriting looked rough. It said, "You shouldn't be here." That's all. No explanation. I shouted again, "I don't want to be here. Let me out." My voice cracked. Still no answer. I felt my heart pounding. I breathed fast and shallow. I clenched my fists. I tried to think of something else. I decided to check behind the counter, see if there was a key or something that could help. I stepped around the register. I opened a few drawers. They had receipts, a calculator, a pen. No key, no phone. Nothing useful. I checked the safe under the counter. Locked. No keypad, just a keyhole. Without a key, it was useless. I took a step back and looked around again. The shelves were neat, each product in place. The floor was clean. The lights flickered again, and I heard the voice on the intercom say my name once more. I replied, "What do you want from me?" The voice did not answer. I waited, heart racing. After a long pause, I heard it say, "You don't belong here." The sound was distorted, like a bad recording. I felt dizzy. I sat down on the floor near the entrance and tried to steady my breathing. I touched the floor with my palms. The tiles felt cool. I listened carefully. I could hear a faint electric buzz from the lights. No other sounds. After a minute, I stood up and tried the door again. It still didn't open. I pressed my forehead against the glass and stared outside. I saw a car drive by. I banged on the door as hard as I could. The driver didn't notice me. It was as if the glass was soundproof or tinted somehow. I searched the store again, more thoroughly this time. I pulled products off shelves, looking for anything hidden. Nothing. I opened the employee door with more force, tried to break the lock using a metal display rack. The rack bent, the door didn't. I yelled in frustration and threw the bent rack aside. My throat felt tight. I gulped air. I tried to ignore the voice and focus on getting out. I examined the walls. They were normal drywall. I could theoretically break through them if I had the right tool. But I only had my hands and some store items. Nothing looked strong enough to break a wall. The ceiling was out of reach and there was no ladder. The back door still wouldn't budge. I tried using a fire extinguisher as a battering ram. The extinguisher cracked a bit of paint off the door, but that was it. As I caught my breath, I heard something odd. The intercom breathed again, but this time it copied my breathing exactly. In and out, matching my rhythm. I held my breath. The intercom fell silent. I started breathing again, and the intercom breathed with me. I shouted, "Stop that!" It didn't stop. I covered my ears and walked away. The sound followed me everywhere in the store. I noticed a faint glow near the floor by the entrance. I leaned down and saw another message written on the tile with what looked like black marker. "You should leave." I screamed, "I'm trying to leave. I can't open the door." The intercom crackled. I heard a faint laugh, or maybe just static that resembled laughter. I punched the glass door with my fist. Pain shot through my hand, and I cursed under my breath. The door remained solid. After a while, I don't know how long, the lights flickered again and went dim for a moment. In that brief darkness, I heard footsteps behind me. I spun around. The lights came back up. No one was there. I checked the aisles carefully. Nothing. But now the intercom was silent. I took that chance and spoke softly. "Can I leave now?" No response. I tried the door again, pulling and pushing. Suddenly the door gave way. It opened outwards easily, no resistance at all. I almost fell onto the sidewalk outside. I took a step forward, blinking in the streetlights. I turned around to see the store behind me. But I saw something strange. I was still inside the store. The door I had just opened led me right back into the same space. I found myself standing in front of the candy aisle again. The front door was closed behind me as if I had never left. I shouted in anger and kicked a display stand. It toppled over, spilling candy bags on the floor. I tried the door a few more times. Each time I opened it, I ended up inside the store again, like a loop. I tried stepping through slowly. I tried running through fast. No difference. I ended up back inside, facing the shelves. I realized I was trapped in some kind of repeating space. I rubbed my eyes and checked the time on my phone. The screen showed no signal, no time, just a blank clock face, as if time had stopped. I felt a growing desperation. My mouth was dry, my hands were shaking. I opened a bottle of water from the fridge and drank it. The water tasted normal. I threw the empty bottle on the floor. I tried talking calmly to the empty air, explaining that I just wanted to leave. I said my name, my address, my reason for coming in. No one responded. After a while, I noticed the intercom crackling again. I heard my name repeated 3 times. I answered, "What do you want?" The voice said, "You're not supposed to be here." I shouted, "I know, let me out." Silence. Then I heard footsteps behind me again. I spun around. Nothing. I ran up and down the aisles, knocking things off shelves, hoping to provoke something. Nothing happened. The store remained neat, no matter what I touched. I realized each time I looked away and back, the shelves were restored to their original order. It was as if my actions had no lasting effect. I felt tears forming in my eyes. My throat tightened. I clenched my teeth to hold back a sob. I paced around, trying to keep calm. I had no plan. I was stuck in a sealed loop of a convenience store with a voice taunting me. I tried the employee door again and again. No luck. Eventually the intercom whispered, "Look down." I looked at the floor. Another message had appeared. "You can leave now." I approached the front door carefully. I touched it with one finger. It felt solid. I pushed, and it opened easily. I stepped outside and looked around. I was on the sidewalk in front of the store. The street was normal. Cars passed by. People walked along. I turned around and looked through the store's window. I saw a normal convenience store interior, with a clerk at the counter this time. A young woman, leaning on her elbow, reading a magazine. I opened the door again, nervous. This time, the door opened into a normal convenience store. The clerk looked up and asked if she could help me. I just stared at her, my heart hammering. I said, "I was just here, and—" I stopped. She frowned, said, "We're closing in a minute. Do you need something?" I shook my head, backed out the door, and let it close behind me. I stood on the sidewalk, breathing hard. The street was quiet. My phone showed the correct time now. It was 1 minute to midnight. I walked away, not looking back. My hand still hurt from punching the glass. I felt the dampness of sweat on my neck. I went home without the batteries. I didn't tell anyone what happened, but I never went back to that store again. I arrived at the train station late in the afternoon. It was busy as usual. People moved in every direction. I heard conversations, footsteps, announcements echoing, and the rumble of trains arriving and departing. Nothing seemed unusual at first glance. I had come because I used this station often on my way home. I knew the layout well. There were several benches along the platform, spaced evenly. I noticed them without much thought. But that day, something caught my attention. One particular bench stood near the far end of the platform, slightly away from the main crowd. I approached it, thinking I might sit there for a moment. As I got closer, I realized the noise around me seemed to fade. At first, I thought maybe my ears were popping. I rubbed them, swallowed hard. The silence increased with every step toward that bench. By the time I stood right in front of it, I heard nothing. No distant chatter, no trains, no announcements. It was as if I had stepped into a soundproof bubble. I felt a chill on my arms. I pulled back, stepping away from the bench. Instantly, the noise returned. People's voices, the shuffling of feet, the distant hum of engines. I frowned and tried again. When I moved closer to the bench, silence fell. When I stepped back, sound came back. I tested it several times. Closer to the bench, complete silence. Farther away, normal station sounds. It made no sense. I looked around for anyone else reacting to this. No one seemed to notice. Passengers walked by the bench, some glanced at it, but no one sat. It was like they chose to avoid it without realizing it. I approached a nearby man and asked if he noticed anything odd about that bench. He gave me a confused look, shrugged, and walked away. No one else seemed interested. I left that day feeling uneasy. That night at home, I kept thinking about the bench. I decided to return the next day. I arrived at a different time, during the rush hour in the morning. The station was crowded and loud. Again, I went to the same bench. The same thing happened. Silence as soon as I got close. Sound as soon as I moved away. I tried sitting on it this time. I lowered myself onto the bench slowly. As soon as I touched it, I felt a heavy pressure in my chest. I could still breathe, but it felt thick, like the air was heavier than normal. I heard no sound at all. My ears felt fine physically, but it was like the world around me vanished. I looked at the people passing by. Their lips moved, their steps fell, but I heard nothing. I got up quickly, heart pounding. Stepping away, the noise of the station rushed back in, startling me. My pulse raced. I tried to calm myself. I left the station and went to work, but all day I felt distracted. After work, I returned. I needed to understand this. I watched from a distance. Almost everyone avoided that bench. People sat on others, read their newspapers, checked their phones, but not on that one. The few who approached it stopped short and picked another spot. They never commented, never hesitated noticeably. It was as if they subconsciously stayed away. I decided to record the bench at night. I wanted to see if something happened after midnight, when the station was empty. A few days later, I brought a small camera. I waited until late. Just before the last train, the station emptied out. A security guard passed by, told me the place would close soon. I hid my camera under a newspaper on a bench across from the strange one. I positioned it so it faced the silent bench. I left the station just before closure, hoping the camera would capture something. The next morning, I retrieved the camera. No one stopped me or asked questions. At home, I watched the footage. For a long time, nothing happened. The station's lights stayed on, but dim. Around 2 or 3 a.m., something strange appeared on the screen. Shadows moved around the bench. They were faint and fast, almost flickering. I paused and replayed the footage. I saw no people, no animals, just odd dark shapes shifting quickly near the bench. The rest of the station looked empty and still. My hands shook as I watched this. I felt a knot in my stomach. I didn't understand what I was seeing. I decided I had to experience it again in person. That evening, after work, I went back. I found the bench unchanged. I approached it and noticed something new. When I was close enough for the silence, I looked at my watch. It had stopped. It showed a time that was several minutes behind the actual time. I stepped back. My watch ticked again. I moved forward. It stopped. Back. It started. This made me sweat. My palms were damp. I tried wiping them on my pants. I stood there, staring at the bench. I wanted to figure out if I could touch it again. I took a deep breath and sat down. Silence and heavy air returned. I tried to speak just to see if I could produce a sound. I opened my mouth, said my own name. I heard nothing. I felt my throat vibrate. My lips formed the word, but no sound reached my ears. I got up, frightened. Stepping back, my voice boomed suddenly back into my ears. I shouted involuntarily, startling a passing couple. They looked at me strangely. I apologized and moved away. Over the next week, I found myself drawn to that bench again and again. Each time, it behaved the same way. Silence when close, normal sound when far. I began to notice something else. Even when I left the station, I sometimes heard a faint ringing in my ears. At home, late at night, I would experience brief moments of silence. as if my ears turned off for a second. It made me jump each time. I worried that the bench had affected me somehow. I tested my hearing by turning on music in my apartment. Everything sounded normal, but when I looked at a photo of the station on my phone, I felt my ears go quiet for a split second. I brushed it off as stress or imagination, but it kept happening. The silence started to follow me. In quiet moments at home, I felt the same heavy air and silence I felt at the bench. It lasted only a moment, then sound returned. I had to do something more. I decided to confront whatever it was at night again. I hid in a corner of the station after hours. It was risky. Security might catch me, but I needed to see it in person. I waited behind a vending machine, heart pounding. The station's lights dimmed. The last workers left. I sat in the darkness, watching the bench from afar. A few hours passed. My legs grew stiff. Then I saw something move near the bench. It was not a person. The light in that area seemed to bend slightly, creating patches of darkness that changed shape. I felt my ears ring. As I watched, the shapes moved around the bench, circling it, twisting. I couldn't hear anything. The entire station seemed mute. I tried tapping the metal side of the vending machine with my finger. I felt the tap, but heard no sound. My chest tightened. My phone's screen suddenly lit up. I looked down. It had turned on by itself. The clock on it was frozen. I looked back at the bench. The shadows were gone. Sound returned abruptly. I heard a faint hum from the vending machine. My phone showed the correct time again. I shuddered and decided to leave quickly before anyone found me there. At home, I tried to avoid thinking about the station, but I couldn't. My watch stopped at random moments now, even far from the bench. I'd be walking down the street and my watch would freeze. A second later, the normal street noise would disappear. I'd stop in my tracks, look around, and then the noise would return. My watch would start ticking again. This began happening more often. I felt trapped by something I didn't understand. One morning I woke up and noticed total silence in my bedroom. Normally, I would hear some distant traffic or the hum of the refrigerator, but there was nothing. I sat up, heart pounding, looked at my clock. Its second hand wasn't moving. I stood up, walked to my window, looked outside. Cars passed by, but I heard nothing. I banged on my wall with my fist. No sound. I shouted at the top of my lungs. Silence. I ran to my front door, opened it, and stepped into the hallway. As soon as I left my apartment, I heard normal sounds. Footsteps from a neighbor upstairs, the elevator humming, distant street noise. I checked my watch. It was ticking normally. I went back into my apartment. Silence again, and my watch stopped. I stumbled backward, breathing hard. My own home had become like the bench. I didn't know what to do. I pulled out my phone and tried recording a video in my apartment. I hoped to catch the silence on camera, but the video showed everything normal. I watched it in the hallway, and I could hear the recording picking up faint background noise. It made no sense. My ears registered silence, but the phone recorded sound. I felt dizzy. Over the next few days, the silence zones spread. The bench at the station remained the same, but now parts of my daily routine were affected. My kitchen, my living room, even a section of the street corner near my building. Each area had a spot where, if I stood there, I heard nothing and my watch stopped. It was like pockets of silence followed me, attaching themselves to places I frequented. I started avoiding these spots. I took different routes to work. I left my apartment door open to maintain normal sound. But as soon as I stepped inside certain areas of my home, silence fell. I tried inviting a friend over to test this. My friend came, and I led him to my bedroom. I expected him to notice something, but he said he heard everything just fine. He heard me speak clearly. I, on the other hand, heard nothing when I was in that spot. He thought I was messing with him. I couldn't prove otherwise. He left, annoyed. I realized the silence wasn't universal. It was personal. I was the only one experiencing it. The bench was the origin, I was sure of that. I decided to face it one last time. I went to the station at midday. It was crowded. I pushed through people until I reached the bench. Standing in front of it, silence fell. I felt sweat on my forehead, my heart thumping. I sat down. Heavy air pressed on my chest. I tried to focus on details. I touched the bench's surface. It felt like old wood, solid and rough. I leaned down, looked under it. Nothing there. I stood up, took a step back into the noise. I shouted at the crowd, "Does anyone notice something about this bench?" A few people gave me strange looks. A station attendant asked if I needed help. I said, "This bench makes the sound vanish." He frowned, approached it casually. He stood right in front of the bench, looked at me, and said he could hear me fine. I stepped toward the bench, entered the silence zone. He continued talking, but I heard nothing. He moved his hands, gesturing, confused. I stepped back. "You didn't lose sound?" I asked. He shook his head. I realized it was all in my perception. The bench triggered something in me. I left the station, trembling. On the street, I found another silence zone waiting for me. Near a bus stop, I stepped onto a certain crack in the sidewalk, and all noise vanished. I stepped back. Noise returned. I started to panic, running through the streets, testing different spots. Some were normal, some had that silence. There seemed to be more of them now. I hurried home. My apartment was half silent zones, half normal. I tried to sleep, but my bedroom fell silent whenever I lay down. It felt suffocating. I moved a mattress to the hallway, outside my apartment door, just to sleep with normal sound. I was exhausted. I didn't know what caused this phenomenon, and I had no way to escape it. Over the next days, the silent zones increased. My workplace had a corner in the office where I heard nothing. The bathroom at a cafe I visited fell silent too. It was spreading to everywhere I went. I felt like I couldn't trust my own senses. I stopped wearing my watch. It was useless now, always stopping and starting. One night, I decided to try to communicate with it somehow. I went to the train station late, approached the bench. Silence fell. I whispered into the silence, knowing I couldn't hear my own voice. I said, "I know you're here." I tried tapping the bench. I felt the vibration but heard nothing. I waited. Nothing happened. I stepped away, defeated. Sound rushed back. At that moment my phone rang. I answered. It was static on the line. I checked the caller ID, just a string of zeros. I said, "Hello?" I heard a faint crackle. Then silence. I hung up. My phone showed no missed calls. I threw it in my pocket, feeling my hands shake. Now everywhere I go, I find these zones. I avoid them, but they trap me at odd times. Standing in line at the grocery store, I shift my foot slightly, and the world goes silent. I move again. Sound returns. I feel like the bench marked me somehow. I can't escape it. I never told anyone else in detail. They wouldn't believe me. My friend already doubted me. This is my life now. I never found a solution. I never understood why that bench created silence for me. I stopped going to that train station. But it doesn't matter. The silence followed me. It's with me always. Some nights, I wake up and find my entire apartment silent. I can't even hear my own breathing. I lie there, heart pounding, feeling the bed under me. Eventually, I move a few inches, and sound returns. I survive by adjusting my position, by keeping out of certain spots. But every day it gets harder. The silence spreads, turning more places into dead zones for my ears. I wish I had never approached that bench. I wish I had never noticed it. Now it's too late. The silence is a part of my world, and I know it's not going away. I first noticed the manuscripts on a Monday morning. It was early, around 8. I had just unlocked the library doors. I worked there as a librarian for several years. The library was small, quiet, and usually predictable. Nothing special ever happened. That day I walked in and saw a stack of old manuscripts on one of the reading tables near the back. There were about 5 or 6 pages, yellowed and stained, covered in handwriting I didn't recognize. They looked old, but not ancient. I approached them, expecting to find a note or a slip indicating where they came from. Nothing. I picked them up, flipped through the pages. The text was in my native language. The handwriting was neat, steady. At first glance, the text looked like a story or a journal. I noticed something strange right away. The text included details about my life, not common knowledge. It mentioned my apartment building, the number on my mailbox, and the way I arranged my books at home. I felt a tightness in my chest. I checked the library's logbook to see if anyone had left these pages. No entries. I asked my co-worker, an older woman who arrived a bit later, if she knew anything. She shrugged and said she hadn't seen anyone leave manuscripts. We didn't have security cameras. I decided to put the pages in a drawer at the circulation desk. I wanted to examine them more closely after the library closed. That evening, I locked up and sat at the circulation desk with a bright lamp on. I read every word. The manuscripts weren't a straightforward story. They felt like fragments of someone's thoughts, describing events I remembered experiencing in my own life. They mentioned my habit of leaving my shoes by the door, the time I caught a cold and stayed home for 3 days, and even the small scratch on my coffee table. No one could know these details. I felt my heart racing. I wondered if someone was spying on me. The next morning, I found more pages. They were on the same table, as if placed there overnight. The library had been locked. I checked the windows, all locked. No sign of forced entry. These new pages were similar, but included my thoughts about work. They described how I felt bored on slow afternoons, how I sometimes got frustrated with certain patrons. I never told anyone these things. I felt exposed, angry, and scared. I took all the pages home in a folder. I locked my apartment door, closed the blinds, and read them again. The pages ended abruptly, mid-sentence, as if incomplete. They left me uneasy. That night, I placed them in my bedroom closet, deep under a pile of clothes. The next morning, I returned to work. More pages were waiting. This time, I recognized the handwriting as the same. The paper looked similar. These new pages described me reading the previous pages at home, how I reacted, how my face looked pale, how I bit my lip. It described my actions from the night before, in detail. It said, he placed the manuscripts under his clothes in the closet at 10:45 p.m., then lay awake until midnight. I almost dropped the pages. I locked these new pages in the library's small safe. I wanted to see if they would stay put. I left work, feeling tense and jumpy. That night, I came back after hours. The library was dark and silent. I opened the safe. The manuscripts were gone. I spun around, checking the shadows. Nothing. I found the manuscripts spread out on a table again, as if mocking my attempt to hide them. I grabbed them and locked the safe once more, double-checking. I left, but I couldn't sleep well. The following morning, more pages appeared. plus the original ones I had locked away. They were arranged neatly in a stack, as if presented to me. Now the text described events that hadn't happened yet. It talked about me receiving a phone call from a friend, someone I hadn't heard from in years. It said I would trip on the library step and drop a box of returned books. I read this at 8:30 a.m. At noon, I received a call from that old friend, completely out of the blue. At 3 p.m., distracted by my thoughts, I tripped at the entrance and dropped a box of books, scattering them on the pavement. I felt sweat on my forehead. I realized the manuscripts were predicting my future. I tried ignoring them, but I couldn't. Each morning, new pages showed up. They described my daily life, my actions, my innermost thoughts, and then told me what would happen next. Some things were minor. I'd forget my keys and have to ring my neighbor's bell. Others were more personal, like running into an ex-girlfriend at the grocery store. All came true, every single one. After a week of this, I grew desperate. I tried destroying the manuscripts. I took a stack home and burned them in my kitchen sink. I watched the paper curl and turn to ash. I felt a sense of relief. I went to bed, exhausted but hopeful. The next morning, I found the same pages, completely intact, spread out on my living room floor. They smelled fresh, like old paper, not burned at all. I cursed and tore them to pieces. I flushed some bits down the toilet, threw others in the trash outside. That night, I woke up to the sound of rustling paper in my apartment. The manuscripts were back, laid out neatly on my coffee table. No sign of damage. I stopped trying to destroy them. I tried locking them in a metal box at the library. I tried burying them in the courtyard behind the building. No matter what I did, they reappeared the next day, waiting for me. Always more pages, detailing my thoughts and actions, predicting what would happen next. I felt trapped and violated. My hands shook when I held them. I stopped sleeping properly. I ate less. I avoided talking to anyone about this. Who would believe me? One morning, I found a note slipped between the pages. It said, "Help me finish." I had no idea what that meant. Finish what? The manuscripts were never truly finished. Each day there were more pages, as if someone wrote them overnight. I checked for hidden cameras in the library. I searched every corner of my apartment. I found nothing. I considered quitting my job, moving away, but something told me that wouldn't help. The manuscripts would follow me anywhere. I decided to confront them directly. Late at night, alone in my apartment, I spoke out loud to the empty room where the manuscripts lay on my kitchen table. I said, "Who are you? What do you want?" No answer. I waited. Nothing. I grabbed a pen and wrote a note on a blank piece of paper. "What do you mean by help you finish?" I placed it under the manuscripts. The next morning I found a reply written on the margin of one of the pages. Complete the story. The story seemed to be my life. Every detail was recorded, my past, my present, my immediate future. I flipped through the latest pages. They described events that would happen that day. I tested one prediction. It said I would spill coffee on my shirt at 10:15 a.m. I tried to be careful. I moved slowly, watched the clock. At 10:10 I stood perfectly still, refusing to touch my coffee. At 10:14 the building's alarm went off due to a malfunction. Startled, I jerked and knocked my coffee cup over, spilling it on my shirt right at 10:15. I couldn't escape the predictions. That evening, I found more pages that described a future event. It said I would encounter someone who would give me a clue at exactly 7 p.m. outside the library. I waited outside at 6:50, nervously watching the sidewalk. At 7 p.m., an old woman I'd never seen before approached me and said, "The end is blank. You must write it." She walked away before I could ask questions. I ran after her, but she vanished into the crowd. I rushed back inside and looked at the manuscripts. I turned to the last page that had appeared. It ended mid-sentence, describing me holding the pen in my hand. There was a large blank space at the bottom. I guessed that was where I was supposed to write something. But what? If the manuscripts were predicting everything, maybe I could change something by writing my own ending. I picked up my pen and hesitated. My hands were sweating. If I wrote something, would it come true? Could I stop this cycle? Could I free myself? I tried writing a simple sentence. Tomorrow, no new pages will appear. I watched the paper. Nothing changed. The ink dried on the page. I went to bed anxious. The next morning I found new pages again, ignoring my written sentence. They still appeared. My attempt failed. That night, I noticed the note, "Help me finish," was appearing more often, written in the margins and at the end of pages. It felt urgent. I realized that the manuscripts weren't just about me. They were about someone else who was stuck, someone who couldn't finish their own story. Maybe they needed me to write a proper ending. I studied the text carefully. The pages talked about my life, but also dropped hints about someone else. There were references to a previous owner of the manuscripts, a visitor who left them behind. He had never been seen by the library staff. The text hinted that he was trapped in the pages, unable to move on. I realized that maybe I needed to write an ending that set him free. I didn't know his name or story. The pages didn't give me that. But I decided to try anyway. I took the pen and wrote in the blank space. The one who created these pages can now rest. His story ends here. He no longer needs to write or follow. He is free. My heart pounded as I wrote each word. I waited, holding my breath. Nothing happened immediately. I went to bed, worried. In the morning, I found no new pages on the table. I felt a surge of hope. I checked the library. No new manuscripts were waiting. I checked the safe, the drawers, the tables. Empty. My watch showed noon, then afternoon passed, then evening. Still no new pages. That night, I returned to my apartment and searched every corner. No pages appeared. I slept better than I had in weeks. The next day, still nothing. It seemed to have stopped. The manuscripts were gone. I had the old ones saved in a box, but no new ones came. I was relieved and confused. Did I solve it? Did my written ending free the strange presence? I examined the old pages. They no longer made me nervous. They felt like old letters now. I noticed one last note, something I hadn't read before. In the margin of a page, a faint sentence. "Thank you." I smiled, feeling a strange sense of calm. I carried on with my life. No more predictions, no more impossible appearances. My future felt open again. I still didn't understand everything, but I knew I had done what was asked. I completed the story by giving it an end, allowing whoever was behind it to stop haunting me. In the following weeks, I got back to my normal routines. The library remained quiet and ordinary. Sometimes I caught myself expecting new pages, but they never came. I felt lighter. My apartment stayed free of strange papers. I could move around without worrying about what I would read the next day. Months later, I still remember the feeling of holding those pages in my hands, the panic of seeing my life written down, and the relief when it ended. I don't have an explanation. I don't know who wrote them or how they appeared, but I know I wrote an ending. I finished the story they wanted me to complete, and that was enough to make it all stop. I never spoke about it to anyone. I kept the old manuscripts locked away in a box. Sometimes I think about throwing them out, but I'm afraid they might reappear. So I let them be, silent and still, evidence of something I can't explain. My life returned to normal, and I've learned to accept that. I bought the train ticket early in the morning. I remember standing at the ticket counter feeling slightly rushed, checking my watch. The line behind me wasn't long. The clerk was polite, but he looked tired. I asked for a seat on the next long-distance train to my destination, a 6-hour ride. He tapped a few keys on his computer, printed the ticket, and handed it over. I took a quick look. Seat 24B. I nodded, thanked him, and walked away. It didn't strike me as unusual at that moment. I arrived at the platform about 15 minutes before departure. People were already boarding. The train was old but clean enough. I looked for my coach. I had a second-class ticket. The train cars had clear signs on the outside with coach letters. I matched my ticket with the correct coach. Everything seemed normal. Inside, I found neat rows of seats. They were arranged in pairs, with numbers printed above them. I walked slowly down the aisle, reading the numbers, 20A, 20B, 21A, 21B, and so on. People were settling in. Some were stowing luggage, others were already seated, flipping through magazines or checking their phones. A slight hum of conversation filled the air. The smell was that typical train smell, a mix of old fabric, coffee, and warm air. I kept walking. 22A, 22B, then 23A, 23B. The next set should be 24A, 24B, but I saw only 24A on the left side next to a window, and then 25A and 25B on the other side. There was no 24B seat. I assumed I made a mistake. I backed up and checked again. Yes, there was 23A and 23B, then just one seat labeled 24A, and then it jumped to 25A, 25B. I frowned. Maybe the seat numbers were out of order. I asked a man sitting nearby if he knew where 24B was. He shrugged and said he never heard of that seat. Another passenger looked up and said something similar. They looked confused, as if I had asked a weird question. I checked my ticket again. It clearly said 24B. I decided to ask the conductor. The conductor came by shortly after departure. He was a middle-aged man with a mustache and a calm manner. I explained the situation, showed him the ticket, and pointed to the missing seat number. He glanced at the ticket, at the seats, and frowned. He said, "Let me check the seating chart." He walked away, leaving me standing in the aisle, holding my bag. I felt a slight tension in my stomach. It was odd, but I assumed it was just a misprint. A few minutes later, he returned. He looked uncertain. He said, "According to the system, you should have seat 24B in this coach, but I don't see it. Are you sure you got on the right coach?" I showed him the coach label. It matched. He scratched his head, apologized, and said the train was full, so finding another seat would be hard. He suggested I wait in the corridor for a moment while he checked with another attendant. I stood by the corridor near the door, feeling annoyed. The train rattled softly, picking up speed. Outside, the scenery started to move by in a blur. Other passengers gave me curious looks as they passed. I felt a bit embarrassed. After about 10 minutes, the conductor returned, looking stressed. He said, "The records show your seat exists, but physically, we don't see it. This is unusual. I'm sorry." I insisted there must be a solution. The conductor leaned in and lowered his voice, as if sharing a secret. He said that sometimes old trains had sections not well documented. Maybe I could check the end of the coach, near the luggage area. Sometimes there were seat extensions or hidden compartments for extra passengers, though it sounded strange. I nodded, confused but desperate. I made my way toward the back of the coach. There was a small luggage area, a sort of alcove. I saw a few suitcases stored there. Behind them, I noticed a narrow passage I hadn't seen before. It was half hidden by a large bag. I moved the bag aside, feeling a little guilty, but determined to find my seat. Behind it was a small door, painted the same color as the walls, with no sign or handle. I pushed gently. It gave way, opening into a narrow corridor I didn't know existed. My heartbeat quickened. I stepped inside. The air felt cooler, and the light was dim. The corridor led to a tiny compartment with 4 seats, 24A, 24B, 24C, 24D. This surprised me because my ticket only mentioned 24B. Here were 4 seats arranged in a small square, 2 facing 2, with a tiny table in the middle. All seats were empty except one. An older woman sat in 24A, staring at me quietly. I cleared my throat and said hello. She looked up slowly. Her eyes were tired. She asked if I had seat 24B. I said yes. She nodded, said almost no one sits there. I asked what she meant. She just shook her head and looked out the small window, which showed only darkness. This was odd since I knew it was daytime outside, and the rest of the train had normal windows showing fields, trees, and towns passing by. This window just reflected a dark void. I placed my bag on the floor and sat down in seat 24B. The cushion felt a bit stiff, and the air smelled stale, like old fabric and dust. I tried to relax. After all, I had a seat now. The older woman didn't speak again. She just sat there, occasionally closing her eyes. I looked around. There was no door now. The opening I came through had vanished, replaced by a solid wall. I stood up, touched the wall. It felt solid, like metal. My stomach tightened. I knew I had come in from that direction. I said to the woman, "Where's the way out?" She shrugged, said she didn't remember. I noticed she wore old-fashioned clothes, a faded sweater, and a scarf. She didn't look surprised by the situation. She tapped the small table with her fingertips, a slow, repetitive sound. I felt my mouth go dry. I tried to stay calm. Maybe I was just confused. I turned back to my seat and decided to wait. Time passed slowly. I checked my phone. No signal. The battery icon looked normal, but the clock on the phone didn't change. It froze at the same minute I sat down. I tried turning it off and on, but it stayed stuck. I asked the old woman for the time, and she said she didn't know. I asked how long she'd been here. She looked at me with a blank expression and said, "Years, maybe." My chest tightened. I forced a small laugh, assuming she was joking or confused. She didn't smile. I pressed on the walls, looking for a panel, a latch, something to return to the main coach. The walls were uniform, no signs. The window remained dark. The train vibrations felt distant, muffled. I listened carefully and heard no muffled conversation, no conductor announcements, nothing. Just a faint hum. I sat back down, heart beating fast. I felt sweat on my forehead. I asked the woman again about how to get out. She mumbled that I could try leaving when the train stops. I asked when it stops. She said, "It doesn't." My hands started shaking. I didn't want to panic, but my mind raced. I tried yelling, banging on the wall. No response. The woman didn't even react. She just stared at the dark window. After what felt like hours, I heard a faint sound, a distant metallic clang. I rushed to the spot where the door had been. The wall still felt solid. Then I heard voices, muffled. I shouted, pounded the wall, screamed for help. Nothing. The voices faded. I slumped down, exhausted. The woman watched me with pity in her eyes. I asked her name. She said a name so softly I didn't catch it. I asked again, and she repeated, barely audible. It sounded like Elena or Ellen. Her voice was shaky. I asked how she got here. She said she bought a ticket long ago, a seat that didn't exist, and she found this place the same way I did. She said people come here sometimes, but they don't stay long. I asked if anyone ever left. She said some vanish when the train arrives, but they never return the same way they came. I felt a surge of anger. I refused to believe this. I stood up again, checking every corner. The compartment was small. 4 seats, a tiny table, 1 window showing nothing, and 4 walls. The seat numbers were printed on small metal plates. I touched them. They were cold. The air smelled musty. My throat felt dry. I asked if there was water. She shook her head. Time passed without any clear measure. My stomach growled. I felt hunger, thirst, and a dull headache. The old woman dozed off sometimes, then woke up, whispered something to herself, and dozed off again. I paced back and forth, though there was hardly any room to pace. I tried to calm down, think logically. Maybe I hit my head and this was a hallucination, but everything felt real. My legs got tired, my mouth parched. After a long while, I felt the train slow down. A gentle decrease in speed. My heart leapt. If the train was stopping, maybe I could find a door again. I pressed my ear to the wall. I heard station announcements, faint but there. I recognized some words, maybe a place name. I banged on the wall, shouted for help. The old woman murmured, "It won't help. They don't see us." I ignored her and kept shouting. The train stopped completely. I felt it rocking slightly, as passengers must have been getting off. I yelled louder, kicked the wall, screamed. My throat hurt. Suddenly, I felt a shift behind me. I turned. The woman stood up. She nodded at me, then pointed to the window. Instead of darkness, I now saw a blur of movement, like people passing by. I rushed closer. The glass felt cold. I saw silhouettes of passengers with suitcases. They looked normal. I banged on the window. No one looked up. I turned back and saw a faint outline in the wall where I had entered. A slight seam. I pushed it. Nothing. I called out, "I'm here. Please help." My voice cracked. I listened carefully. The station noises faded as the train started moving again. My hope drained. The wall had no give. I slumped into 24B, my head in my hands. The old woman sat back in 24A. She said, "It happens every time. We see them. They don't see us." I felt tears in my eyes. This was insane. I asked if she had tried leaving when someone else came. She said yes, but she never found a way out. Over time, she gave up. I refused to give up. I stayed alert, trying to track the passing of time by my hunger and thirst. Eventually, I felt the train slow down again. Another stop, maybe hours later. I didn't know. I prepared myself. This time I would be calm and search for any sign of a door. When the train stopped, I saw outlines again through the window. Different people, different station. I touched the wall methodically, inch by inch. My fingertips felt a slight depression. I pressed hard. A panel clicked open. I gasped. I pulled at the panel. It revealed a narrow slot. Inside, a small paper tag. It had my name on it, and under it said, "Passenger not on list." My heart raced. I didn't remember anyone calling my name or checking passenger lists. I pulled the paper out. The old woman watched silently. I tried calling out again, holding the paper. Still no response from outside. The train began to move. I slammed the panel shut in frustration. I showed the paper to the old woman. She shrugged. I asked if she had one. She said she never found any. I thought maybe this was a clue. If I wasn't on the passenger list, maybe I shouldn't be here. Maybe that meant I could leave. I decided to try something else. The next time the train slowed, I waited until the last moment before it fully stopped. Right before it came to a halt, I pressed the panel area again. The wall felt softer for a second. I pushed harder, leaning my shoulder into it. With a scraping sound, a small section of the wall shifted, revealing a tiny gap. Light from the station seeped through for a moment. I shouted for help, pushed my arm through, waving the paper with my name. I saw a face outside look my way, startled, just as the train began to move again. I yanked my arm back before it got stuck. I turned to the old woman and said I saw someone react. She smiled sadly, said she saw that happen once before. That person never came back. I refused to accept that. If someone saw me, maybe they would report it. Maybe at the next station, the conductor would look harder. We went through another cycle, hours passing in silence, the train stopping, me trying to find a way out. Each time, I managed to open that gap a little earlier. I tried shouting the name of the station. Once, a man outside yelled something back, but I couldn't understand. The train moved again, sealing me inside. I lost count of how many stops we passed. My throat burned from shouting. I felt weak with hunger and thirst. The old woman looked worse, as if she was fading. She spoke less and less. I asked her once if she remembered her life before this. She just shook her head. Eventually, at one stop, I managed to push the panel so hard that it broke off entirely. The wall cracked, and I saw not just a gap, but a small opening big enough to slip through if I pushed. I squeezed my shoulder through, then my head. Outside, I saw the real train coach. The seats were full of passengers. They looked at me in shock as I emerged from a gap in the wall that hadn't been there a moment before. I fell out into the aisle, gasping. The conductor rushed over, demanding to know where I came from. I looked back at the wall. It was solid again, no gap, no compartment. Just a normal train wall. Passengers stared at me. I tried to explain, but they looked confused. The conductor said my name wasn't on the passenger list. He asked for my ticket. I handed it to him. He frowned and said this seat number didn't exist. He asked how I boarded the train. I couldn't explain. I felt dizzy and collapsed into an empty seat nearby. At the next station, the conductor asked me to step off and talk to security. They checked my ID, asked me questions. I told them about the hidden compartment and the old woman. They exchanged glances, told me to rest. They said they had no record of me buying a ticket. The station clerk who sold it to me didn't remember me. They treated me like I was confused or lying. I eventually left the station, shaken. I never got to my original destination by train. I took a bus instead. I never learned who the old woman was or why that seat existed. The memory still haunts me. Sometimes I wake up and remember her tired eyes and the dark window. I remember the stale air and the silence. I still have that ticket stub with 24B written on it, even though the railway insists no such seat ever existed on that train. I first noticed the sound around 2 in the morning. I was lying in bed, half awake, thinking about work. Suddenly, I heard soft music coming from downstairs. It was faint, like a distant radio. I live alone in a small house, and the basement is just a storage area with old boxes and some tools. I don't have speakers down there, no stereo, nothing that should make noise. I sat up, listened carefully. The music was quiet, a gentle melody at first. I couldn't identify the tune. After a minute, it faded away. I shrugged it off and went back to sleep. The next evening, around midnight, it happened again. The same soft melody, drifting up from the basement. I walked down the stairs, turned on the basement light, and listened at the door. The sound stopped immediately. I opened the door and stepped onto the cold concrete floor. The basement smelled like dust and old cardboard. I flipped on my flashlight, looked around. Nothing unusual. No devices, no radios. The silence was complete. I went back upstairs, locked the door, felt a little uneasy. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, or maybe a neighbor's music traveling through the pipes. Over the next few days, the music started appearing at random times. Sometimes late at night, sometimes during the afternoon. Always soft at first, then growing slightly louder, but never blasting. It sounded old-fashioned, like something from a record player. There was a gentle crackle to it, as if it were on vinyl. I don't own a record player, so I knew it wasn't mine. I checked the basement several times, even turned off all the power in the house once to see if the sound stopped. It didn't. Whenever I entered the basement, it vanished. I started feeling nervous. My heart would race whenever I heard those first notes. My palms got sweaty. I tried recording it on my phone. The recordings always came out silent. I tried calling a friend to come over, but the music never played when someone else was around. It seemed to happen only when I was alone. After a week of this, I decided I had to stay in the basement until I caught the source of the sound. I waited until I heard the music again, late at night. I stood quietly at the top of the basement stairs, then slowly opened the door and stepped down, one step at a time. The music continued for a few seconds, then stopped abruptly as soon as my foot touched the basement floor. I searched every inch with a flashlight. I moved boxes, opened drawers, looked behind shelves. Nothing. The next night I tried again. This time I kept the basement door open and stood on the top step. The music played softly. I held my breath, leaned forward, staying on the stairs but not entering fully. I could almost make out some kind of piano melody with faint strings behind it. It sounded familiar, but I couldn't place it. As soon as I stepped fully inside, it cut out. Silence again. The day after that, I decided to leave a tape recorder running in the basement when I wasn't there. The recorder was an old device I found at a garage sale years ago. I set it up on a shelf, pressed record, and went upstairs. I heard the music start an hour later. I let it play for a while, then went down after it stopped. I rewound the tape and listened. Nothing but silence. It was like the music never existed. I grew frustrated and a bit scared. My heart pounded every time I thought about it. My hands shook when I tried to sleep at night. I started leaving lights on in the house. I avoided going near the basement after dark. But the music continued. Sometimes I woke up to it. Sometimes I heard it while sitting in my living room watching TV. It always came from below. One morning, I woke up and found something in the basement that hadn't been there before. I only discovered it by accident. I went down to grab a box of old clothes. As I moved a stack of boxes, I saw a dusty turntable sitting on a stool in the corner. I froze. I had never seen it before. It looked old, with a wooden base and a metal arm. No cables, no power source, just sitting there. My heart thumped. I touched it with one finger. It felt solid, a real object. I asked myself how it got there. I live alone. I keep my doors locked. No one else has a key. I pulled the turntable into the light and examined it. It had no logo, no brand name. The needle looked worn, but intact. There was no record on it. I tried spinning the platter. It moved smoothly, quietly. I felt a chill on my neck. I carried it upstairs and placed it on my kitchen table. I wanted it out of the basement. Maybe it was some sort of prank or something left by the previous owner of the house. But why show up now? That night, I heard the music again. This time it was louder, and I recognized a pattern. The melody started the same way, a gentle piano line, then some strings. It sounded old, maybe from the 1950s or 60s. I followed the sound downstairs to the living room. It seemed to come from below again. I ran to the kitchen, checked the turntable. It was gone. I know I left it on the kitchen table, but now it wasn't there. I rushed back to the basement. The turntable was on the stool again, as if I had never moved it. My heart pounded. I felt my throat go dry. I approached it slowly. The music stopped. I stood there, shining my flashlight on it. Then I heard a faint scratch, and a new sound began. A voice whispering my name very softly. I jerked back, almost dropping the flashlight. The voice cut off, replaced by silence. I grabbed the turntable and tried to take it outside. I carried it upstairs and opened my back door. The hinges squeaked. It was dark out. I walked to the edge of my yard and set it down on the grass, breathing hard. I wanted to see if it would stay there. I went back inside, locked the door, and went to bed. In the morning I checked the yard. No turntable. I felt a hollow feeling in my stomach. I went to the basement and found it there, on the stool, as if it had never moved. I cursed under my breath, fear and anger mixing in my head. I decided to try throwing it away. I put it in a large trash bag, tied it tightly, and placed it in the garbage bin outside. The garbage truck came that afternoon. I watched them empty the bin. It was gone. That night, the music returned, louder than ever. I heard it the moment the sun went down. It rose from the basement like someone turned up the volume. I rushed down, expecting the room to be empty. Instead, I saw the turntable spinning slowly. A vinyl record I had never seen before sat on the platter. The label read, "The Melody of Your Life." My legs felt weak. I reached out and stopped the record with my hand. The needle scratched. The music halted. I lifted the needle off the record. The vinyl felt cold and smooth. I looked at the title again. My name was written in small letters on the edge of the label. I dropped it, stunned. I backed away, breathing fast. The turntable started spinning on its own, needle hovering just above the groove. No power, no cables, but it moved. I shouted, "Stop!" My voice echoed in the empty basement. The turntable slowed, as if listening, then stopped spinning. The needle dropped onto the vinyl with a soft click. I heard a faint crackle, then my own voice humming a tune I recognized from childhood. I stood there, shaking. The record was playing something personal, something from my past that no one else should know. I tried to lift the arm again. It resisted. The record kept playing scenes from my life in sound, snatches of music I heard when I was a kid, my mother's voice singing lullabies, the laughter of an old friend. Tears welled up in my eyes. My hands shook. I forced the needle off the record again, this time pulling harder until it snapped. The tip of the needle broke off. I threw it on the floor and crushed it under my foot. Silence followed. The turntable stopped moving. I picked up the vinyl, intending to break it. I bent it with all my strength, but it wouldn't crack. It felt rigid, unbreakable. I banged it against the wall. No effect. I threw it across the room. It landed softly, as if cushioned by air. I screamed in frustration, my voice echoing in the cold space. I decided to stay up all night watching it. I brought a chair and sat near the turntable, shining a lamp directly on it. Hours passed. Nothing moved. I nodded off at some point, my head lolling forward. A scratching sound woke me. The needle was back, somehow intact, lowering onto the vinyl. Music began again, this time slower, a sad melody. I jumped up, tried to grab the record, but the turntable spun faster. My hand slipped off. The music changed to a harsh static, then a whisper. "Don't remove it." My heart hammered in my chest. My legs felt weak. I backed away, tripped over a box, fell to the floor. The voice repeated, "Don't remove it." in a low hiss, then faded into soft piano notes again. I crawled to the stairs, too scared to stand. I rushed upstairs, slammed the basement door, locked it. I paced around my living room, breathing hard. I had to get help. I called a friend. He came over the next day. I showed him the basement. The turntable sat on the stool, silent and still. No record, nothing unusual. My friend said I looked pale and told me to relax, maybe get some sleep. I tried explaining everything, but he didn't believe me. He said I might be stressed or imagining things. When he left, I checked the basement again. The vinyl was back on the turntable, the title clear, The Melody of Your Life. I tried ignoring it. I closed the basement door and left the house. I drove around town, visited a cafe, tried to take my mind off it. When I returned home, the music greeted me before I even opened the door. It seeped through the walls. I knew I had to face it. I went downstairs and said, "What do you want?" The music stopped. The voice whispered again, "Listen." I swallowed, my throat dry. The record spun, playing moments of my life in sound, birthdays, conversations, even embarrassing moments I never told anyone about. It was like my entire existence was etched into those grooves. I realized maybe I had to let it play through. I sat on the floor, arms wrapped around my knees, listening. The record played on, showing me my past through sound. After what felt like hours, the music changed tone. It started playing music I didn't recognize. Distant, dissonant tunes, whispers of my name, fragments of words. Then it showed me a voice saying, "Let go." I whispered, "Let go of what?" The record crackled. No answer. The music continued. I noticed the lights in the basement flickering. My head ached. I stood and tried to leave. The basement door wouldn't open. The knob stuck. I kicked it, yelled. The turntable spun faster, the music growing louder and chaotic. I covered my ears, but I still heard it. Through the noise, I heard my own voice saying, "It's yours now." I looked at the record, spinning wildly. I reached for it one last time. This time, it let me pick it up. The turntable stopped. The basement fell silent. I held the vinyl in my hand, heart pounding. The door now opened easily. I climbed the stairs, holding the record tight. I decided to store it far away, maybe in an abandoned storage unit. I drove out of town, found a storage facility, rented a small locker, and placed the record inside. I locked it and left. When I got home, the turntable was gone. The basement was empty, as if nothing had happened. I waited for the music, but it never returned. Days passed. I slept better. I started to relax. One afternoon, I opened my mailbox and found a small envelope with no return address. Inside was a photograph of the turntable and the vinyl sitting in my basement. On the back, a note read, "You found the melody. It's yours to keep." I felt a shiver run down my spine. I rushed to my basement, expecting to see it again, but it was empty. I checked my locks, my windows, everything secure. I decided to ignore the note and go on with my life. For now, the music hasn't returned. But I keep thinking about that record in the storage locker. I wonder if it's still there, spinning silently in the dark. I haven't gone back to check. I'm afraid if I do, I'll hear the melody again, and this time it won't let me go. I first noticed the problem with the portraits on a Tuesday evening. I had been living in this old house for a few months. The previous owner left some old paintings along the staircase. They showed people I didn't recognize, probably old relatives or something like that. They were dusty and crooked when I moved in, so I straightened them and left them there. I didn't think much about it until that Tuesday. I remember coming home late, tired from work. I climbed the stairs, and I saw that one of the frames hung at a slight angle, maybe just a few degrees off. I frowned because I was sure I had left it straight before. I adjusted it again, pressed it firmly so it wouldn't move, and continued upstairs. The next morning, I noticed all the portraits were tilted again, some more than others. A few were almost sideways. I felt a chill run through me. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, so I assumed vibrations from passing trucks or something similar might have caused it. I carefully aligned each one again, making sure they were secure. Then I went to work. When I returned in the evening, the portraits were crooked again. This time it was worse. All of them were off by different angles. I touched one of the frames, felt a slight sway. I said out loud, "This is strange." No one answered. I lived alone. I leaned in, checking the hooks. They seemed fine. The next night, I decided to see what happened during the night. I set up a small camera at the end of the hallway, aimed at the staircase. I left it recording overnight while I slept. In the morning, the portraits were crooked again, of course. I played back the footage, anxious. The video showed the frames hanging still for hours. Around 3 a.m, I saw them move slightly, almost as if nudged by an invisible hand. It wasn't a quick jerk. It was a slow, steady motion. One by one, each frame tilted just enough to be noticeable. No one appeared on camera. No shadowy figure, no obvious source. Just the frames moving on their own. I felt my mouth go dry. My heart sped up. I tried ignoring it, but now I knew something was off. I spent the day distracted, thinking about it. That evening, I took the portraits down. I removed every single one. I placed them in the attic, out of sight. I breathed a sigh of relief, thinking that solved it. But the next morning, new portraits were hanging on the wall in the same spots. I nearly dropped my coffee mug when I saw this. I had not put them there. They were different portraits, too. Faces I didn't recognize. I ran to the attic, found the ones I had removed still sitting there, untouched. So where did these new ones come from? I didn't know what to do. I grabbed one of the new portraits off the wall and examined it closely. The paint looked old, the frame dusty and worn. The face in the painting looked almost too real. The eyes seemed to follow me. I touched the surface. Dry paint, normal texture. I leaned the frame against the wall on the floor, refusing to hang it up again. The next morning, that portrait was back on the wall, perfectly hung. The others had changed positions slightly, as if they had shifted during the night. This was impossible. I tried calling a friend, asking if they could come over and help me figure this out. He promised to visit the next evening. That night, I left the camera recording again. I also pushed a chair against the stairway to see if I could block access. When I checked in the morning, the chair had moved aside and all the portraits were slightly askew again. The camera footage showed the same slow, eerie movement of the frames, but no sign of anyone or anything doing it. Just that strange motion, like they were alive. My friend arrived that evening. I showed him the footage. He looked pale and didn't know what to say. He asked if I was pranking him. I swore I wasn't. We decided to remove the portraits again, this time taking them outside. We carried them to the garage and locked the garage door. We checked the stairway wall. Empty. Good. We shared a pizza and tried to calm down. Maybe we both imagined it. After a while, we checked the staircase again. The portraits were back, different ones again, each with a distinct face. Some faces looked younger, others older, some smiling faintly, others frowning. My friend cursed under his breath. We tried recording again that night, but this time we watched in real time from my laptop, set up with a live feed. For hours, nothing happened. We grew tired and started nodding off. Around midnight, I noticed something in the corner of the video frame. A slight movement of one portrait's frame, just a few millimeters. Then another. We rushed to the staircase, but when we arrived, they looked normal, except for their slight tilt. We spent half the night just staring at them. Nothing obvious happened. Finally, my friend said he had to leave. This was too weird for him. He suggested I contact a professional or something. But what kind of professional do you call for moving portraits? I decided to remove the nails from the wall. I filled the holes, smoothed the plaster, painted over them. Now there was no place to hang a frame. That should stop them, I thought. The next morning, I woke up to find new portraits hanging directly from the wall, no hooks or nails. They somehow attached themselves flat against the plaster. My stomach knotted. They were closer now, almost at eye level. Their faces looked more detailed, the brush strokes sharp. I avoided using the stairs for a while. I slept in the living room, too scared to go upstairs. I heard soft creaking at night, like frames shifting quietly. I set up a motion detector alarm in the hallway. It never triggered, even though the portraits kept moving. After a few days, I noticed something else. The faces in the portraits changed over time. At first, they were just random people. Now, I recognized some facial features that reminded me of neighbors or distant relatives. One frame showed a man who looked like my grandfather, who passed away years ago. Another showed a woman who resembled my old teacher from elementary school. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. This couldn't be random. I yelled at them one evening, out of frustration. I stood there shouting, "Who are you? What do you want?" My voice echoed in the hallway. The portraits didn't move, but I felt like I was being watched. I backed away slowly, my heart pounding. No answer, obviously. Desperate, I took one portrait and tried to break it. I slammed it on the floor, stomped on it. The glass cracked, the frame splintered. Inside, the canvas tore slightly. I felt good for a second, like I had taken control. I picked up the pieces and threw them in the trash outside. I came back in and found the same portrait back on the wall, completely intact, as if I never touched it. The trash can outside was empty again. I felt panic rising in my chest. My breathing quickened. I stopped eating normally, barely slept. I kept all the lights on. At night I heard faint scraping noises, like the frames adjusting themselves. One morning, I noticed one painting leaned slightly out from the wall, as if peering at me. When I got closer, it flattened again. My hands shook. I called another friend, who was braver, and explained everything. He thought I was joking, but agreed to come by. When he arrived, we found that the portraits were still there, but now featuring faces we both recognized from our childhood neighborhood. He gasped, said this was impossible. We tried spraying them with water, wiping them down, covering them with blankets. The blankets fell off by themselves. The water dried instantly, leaving no mark. My friend left in a hurry, saying he couldn't help me. I decided I couldn't live like this. I planned to leave the house, but when I approached the front door with a suitcase, I heard a groaning sound behind me. I turned to see the portraits shifting rapidly, tilting in unison, making a low creak. I reached for the doorknob, and it wouldn't turn. I tried a window. It wouldn't budge. It was as if the house had sealed itself. The portraits seemed to tilt a bit more, as if acknowledging my attempt to leave. I started having trouble breathing. My chest felt tight. I ran back upstairs, tried the bedroom window, no luck. I grabbed a hammer, tried to break a window. The glass wouldn't crack. The frames on the staircase rattled slightly, a reminder they were still there. I yelled, "Let me out!" My voice echoed uselessly. At night I tried to sleep in a corner of the living room, as far from the stairs as possible. I heard soft scraping sounds, like footsteps on wooden steps, but I knew it was just the frames adjusting again. I covered my ears, closed my eyes, tried to block it out. When I woke in the morning, a new row of smaller portraits appeared at the base of the stairs. They were tiny, like miniatures, and they showed my face from different angles, as if painted secretly while I slept. I felt tears well up in my eyes. I was trapped, and now they had me as one of their subjects. I begged aloud for mercy, talking to empty air. I said, "What do you want? I'll do anything." No response. I tried removing the walls, punching at the drywall. It hurt my hands and did nothing. The staircase remained intact, the portraits unmoved. Over the following days, I noticed that the portraits moved closer. Each night they shifted a bit lower down the staircase, creeping closer to the living area. I sat in the corner, watching them approach. My heart pounded non-stop. I ate stale crackers and sipped water from the tap. I felt weak, trapped, defeated. Eventually the portraits reached the bottom of the stairs. They hung on the walls of the living room now. I stood in the center of the room, surrounded by painted eyes, all watching me. I lifted a trembling finger and touched one canvas. It felt warm, almost pulsing. Then, without warning, I heard a faint sound of wood creaking behind me. I spun around and saw one of the frames leaning out, extending like a hinge, revealing a dark space behind it. It was as if the portrait had become a door. I stared at it, unsure. The darkness beyond looked endless. I hesitated, then stepped forward. If there was a way out, it might be through there. I stuck my head inside the opening. It smelled like old, stale air. I reached out a hand, felt a rough surface. Suddenly the portrait swung shut, catching my hand in the frame. I screamed in pain, yanked my hand back. The frame reopened slowly, as if teasing me. I cradled my injured hand, tears on my face. I knew I had to try again. I had no choice. I waited until the frame door opened wider, then quickly ducked inside, pulling my body through. It felt like squeezing through a tight tunnel. I could barely breathe. I crawled forward in total darkness, feeling my way along rough surfaces. After what felt like hours, I emerged into my front yard. Fresh air hit my face. I stumbled onto the grass, falling to my knees. I looked around. It was dawn. The house behind me looked normal. No strange portraits visible through the windows. The front door stood open. I got up, ran to the street, heart pounding. I never returned to that house. I called the realtor, said I had to move out immediately. I didn't bother explaining. I took only what I had in my car. I never retrieved the rest of my belongings. I refused to step inside again. To this day, I can't explain what happened. I still have nightmares of frames tilting slowly, watching me, waiting. Sometimes I wake up sweating, convinced I see a portrait on my bedroom wall. But then I turn on the light, and it's just a blank wall. I pray it stays that way. I first saw the suitcase in the airport waiting area. It was late afternoon. I was sitting on a plastic chair near my gate, checking my phone for flight updates. The flight was delayed by an hour. The waiting area was almost empty. I noticed a small, dark suitcase propped against a wall. It looked ordinary, a simple black carry-on with a ripped identification tag. I glanced around. No one seemed to claim it. It just sat there, slightly scuffed, handle up, wheels resting on the floor. After 15 minutes, I saw a staff member pass by. I waved him over and pointed at the suitcase. He looked at it, shrugged, and said no one had reported any lost luggage. I asked if he could take it to Lost and Found. He said he would. He picked it up and walked away. I watched him go around the corner. I assumed that was the end of it. My flight boarded about an hour later. The delay annoyed me, and I was tired. I had a long trip ahead. I reached my destination late at night and took a taxi home. Once home, I parked my car in the garage, carried my bags inside, and went straight to bed. The next morning, I opened my car's trunk to grab a jacket I had left inside. My heart skipped a beat when I saw the same dark suitcase sitting there. The exact same one from the airport, same scratches, same torn tag. I stepped back, rubbing my eyes. I had never put it in my car. I locked my car yesterday after arriving. No one else had access. I felt a surge of confusion and a hint of fear. I pulled the suitcase out and placed it on my driveway. I looked around to see if anyone was watching. The street was quiet, just a normal morning. I touched the suitcase. It felt cool. The handle was slightly worn. I hesitated, then tried the zipper. It was locked with a small padlock. I shook it gently. Something inside shifted, like clothes or a soft object. I didn't know what to do. I decided to call the airport. I called the airport's lost and found. They said no suitcase matching my description had been turned in. I described it carefully. They said they had no record of it. I tried explaining that a staff member took it. They said maybe it never reached them. They told me to bring it in if I had it. I said I would. I placed the suitcase in my living room, planning to drive it to the airport later. I went to the kitchen to make coffee. When I returned to the living room, the suitcase was gone. I stood there, stunned. I checked the front door. Locked. Windows locked. I walked around my house, searching every room. No suitcase. My heart pounded. I felt sweat on my forehead. I had just seen it a minute ago. I sat down, trying to calm myself. Maybe I was exhausted, stressed. I decided to forget about it for now. I got dressed and left for work, still feeling uneasy. When I came home in the evening, I opened my front door, and there it was again. The same suitcase, sitting in the hallway as if it belonged there. I froze. The house smelled normal, nothing unusual. I approached it slowly. The torn tag still dangled from the handle. I noticed faint handwriting on the tag, smudged and unreadable. I reached out and touched the lock. It was secure. I knelt down and saw a small note tucked under the suitcase. It said, "You found what you needed?" I picked up the note, my hands shaking. The handwriting was unfamiliar. I felt my heart racing, a lump in my throat. Who wrote this? What did they mean? I said out loud, "Who's here?" No answer, just silence. I searched the house again. No one inside. I tried calling a friend, told him about the suitcase. He laughed, said maybe I was mixing it up with another bag. I insisted it was the same one. He suggested I take it to the police. I agreed that might be the best idea. Before leaving, I took photos of the suitcase with my phone. Then I dragged it outside to my car. I placed it in the trunk and locked the car. I drove to the local police station. On the way, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. It said, "Return it to the right place." I nearly dropped the phone. I pulled over to read it again. No caller ID, just a blocked number. I typed, "Who is this?" No reply. At the police station, I explained the situation. The officer looked skeptical, but agreed to hold the suitcase until further notice. He took my details and said they would open it if needed, maybe track the owner. I thanked him and left. I went home feeling lighter. The suitcase was gone, safe with the police. I tried to relax, watch some TV, eat dinner. Around midnight, I heard a noise in my garage, a soft thump. I grabbed a flashlight and went to check. My garage door was locked, no sign of forced entry. But when I opened the trunk of my car, the suitcase was there again. My stomach twisted. I had left it with the police. How was it back? I slammed the trunk shut and ran back inside. I locked all the doors, closed the blinds. My phone buzzed again. Another text. "You can't leave it there." My hands trembled as I typed, "What do you want?" No response. I paced around my living room, trying to think. I decided to drive to the police station again right now. I returned to the garage, opened the trunk. The suitcase was gone. Empty trunk. I stared, my heart hammering. I checked the back seat. Nothing. Confused, I slammed the trunk and turned to go inside. It was sitting on the driveway now, as if moved silently behind my back. I screamed, startled. I ran up to it and kicked it, furious. It didn't budge. I pulled on the handle, tried to roll it. The wheels squeaked quietly. I took a deep breath, loaded it back into the trunk, and sped to the police station. When I arrived, I ran inside and told the officer it had returned. He looked at me like I was crazy. He showed me the storage room where he had placed the suitcase earlier. There it was, sitting on a shelf. I stared at it, then ran back outside. The trunk of my car was empty. The one on the shelf had no torn tag. I rushed back in and checked. The shelf suitcase looked identical but not torn. I was losing my mind. I apologized to the officer, told him I must have been mistaken. I left, my heart racing. Now I had two suitcases somehow, one at the station, one following me around. Or did I imagine the one outside my house? When I got back home, I didn't see the suitcase anywhere. I locked every door and window, left all the lights on, and tried to sleep on the couch. I dozed off around 3 a.m. In the morning, my phone had another message. "Why didn't you return it?" I felt nauseous. I wrote back, "Return it where?" After a moment, my phone buzzed. "To the place you found it." The airport? I guessed that must be it. I decided to do exactly that. I got dressed, drove to the airport with no suitcase. I planned to wait and see if it appeared there somehow. I parked in the same spot I parked the first time. I went inside the terminal, walked to the spot where I first saw it. Nothing unusual. People came and went. I sat and waited, feeling anxious. After an hour, I got up and checked the bathroom. When I came out, the suitcase was waiting for me by the wall. Same one, torn tag and all. I approached it cautiously. My phone buzzed. "Don't run." I looked around. No one seemed to notice me. I bent down and tried the lock again. Still locked. I felt a surge of anger. I grabbed the suitcase and marched to the lost and found counter. I explained I had found this suitcase again and wanted to return it. The staff member checked the tag, frowned, said the name was scratched out. She opened her computer system, searched, found nothing. She looked bored. She said they would hold on to it. I insisted she keep it safe. She nodded, placed it behind the counter. I stepped back, relieved. As I turned to leave, my phone buzzed again. "Not here." I glared at my phone. "Where then?" I typed. "Where?" No answer. I walked away, got in my car, and left. On the drive home, I thought maybe I should open it by force. Maybe inside there was a clue or something. But each time I tried to get rid of it, it reappeared. Would it let me open it? When I got home, it was on my kitchen floor. I nearly dropped my keys. I cursed under my breath. "What do you want?" I shouted at it. No answer. I checked my phone. A new message. "Return it where you found it." I found it at the airport waiting area. I tried that. It didn't work. Maybe it meant the exact spot. I placed it right where I first saw it. That didn't help. Did I need to wait there? I decided to try again. I took the suitcase to the airport once more, placed it in the exact spot, and waited nearby. People passed by, ignored it. No one claimed it. My phone buzzed. Look at the tag. I bent down and inspected the tag carefully. With my fingernail, I scraped some dirt off. Underneath, I saw faint letters, a gate number, Gate C12. That was where I first sat waiting for my delayed flight. I moved the suitcase to Gate C12. My hands shook. I set it down beside a row of chairs. My phone buzzed. Leave it. I stepped back and watched from a distance. 20 minutes passed. A man in a gray suit approached. He looked around, then picked up the suitcase and walked away. My phone buzzed. You did well. I exhaled, feeling relief flood my body. I started walking toward the exit, eager to leave this behind forever. But as I reached the main door, I heard my phone buzz again. I almost didn't want to look. I read the message. Check your car. My heart sank. I ran to the parking lot, opened my trunk. The suitcase was there again, identical to the one the man had taken. I screamed in frustration. This time, I couldn't control my panic. I pulled the suitcase out, threw it on the ground, and stomped on it. The lock popped open. I tore it open, my breath ragged, ready to see what was inside. Inside, I found clothes that looked like mine. Shirts, pants, my old jacket. Underneath was a small box. I opened the box. Inside it was a photograph of me as a child, standing with my parents at an airport. I gasped, tears in my eyes. How was this inside? My phone buzzed. This is yours. Take it. I grabbed the photo, my hands shaking. I looked under the clothes again. Another note said, You found what you needed. Now return the rest. I pulled everything out of the suitcase. Underneath was a second layer of random items, old keys, a watch, papers with unfamiliar handwriting. I took the photo and left the rest inside. I closed the suitcase and walked back to Gate C12. The man in the gray suit was gone. I set the suitcase down and waited. After a few minutes, a cleaning staff member came by, looked at the suitcase, and took it away. My phone buzzed. It's done. I felt weak in the knees. I hurried back to my car, checking the trunk. Empty now, no suitcase. I drove home, checking my phone every few minutes. No more messages. At home, no suitcase. Just the photo in my hand. I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the photo, remembering that old trip with my parents. I hadn't thought about it in years. I felt tears on my cheeks. I didn't understand what happened or why, but the suitcase was gone now. Over the next few days, I kept waiting for it to return. It never did. The messages stopped. The photo stayed with me, a quiet reminder of something I still didn't fully grasp. I tried calling the airport to ask about any missing bag incidents. They had no records. I tried calling the police officer who had seen the other suitcase. He didn't remember me clearly and had no notes of that incident. Eventually, I stopped trying to explain it. I kept the photo in my wallet. I moved on with my life. But sometimes, late at night, I think about that suitcase. I remember the locked zipper, the torn tag, the messages on my phone. I remember the strange instructions and the feeling of being watched. I wonder what would have happened if I never returned it to Gate C12. And I wonder who sent those messages. I never found a solid answer, but at least it's over now. The suitcase is gone, and I'm free. I hope it stays that way.